I need to tell someone about this, even if it makes me look like an idiot. Maybe especially because it makes me look like an idiot. I've been carrying it around for nearly 2 years now, and the weight of not talking about it has become worse than the fear of judgment. So here it is. Back in early 2023, I was working as a graphic designer for a small agency in Newcastle. The job was fine, the pay was adequate, and I had a nice little flat in Jesmond that I shared with my girlfriend, Emma. We'd been together about 3 years at that point. Everything was stable, comfortable. I had no reason to go looking for anything else. But there's this thing about comfort, isn't there? It makes you complacent, makes you think you're untouchable. That bad things happen to other people, people who make stupid decisions or take unnecessary risks. I thought I was smarter than that. The whole thing started because I was bored one evening. Emma was visiting her parents in Durham, and I had the flat to myself. I'd finished the work I'd brought home, had eaten dinner, and found myself with nothing to do. I'd read articles about the dark web before, mostly out of idle curiosity. The usual sensationalist stuff about illegal marketplaces and hidden services. But I'd also read more measured pieces explaining that a lot of it was actually mundane. Whistleblowers, journalists, privacy advocates, people with legitimate reasons for wanting anonymity. I spent maybe 20 minutes getting access. It wasn't complicated. I'd expected it to be this elaborate process, but it wasn't. Just a few simple steps, and suddenly I was looking at a completely different internet. Sites with strange addresses, pages that loaded slowly, everything looking dated and slightly broken. For the first hour, I found exactly what I'd expected. Abandoned pages, broken links, marketplaces I had no intention of using. A few discussion boards where people talked about things that range from boring to disturbing. I was starting to think the whole experience was overrated when I stumbled across something called the vetted list. It wasn't advertised anywhere obvious. I found it through a link someone had posted on one of the discussion boards, mentioning it in passing. The description was vague, something about verified services for verified people. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was surprisingly professional. Clean design, minimal but functional, not like most of the sites I'd seen. The homepage explained that this was a directory of services, everything from research assistance to document retrieval to personal security. But unlike other directories, both the service providers and the people seeking services had to go through a screening process. The idea was that it weeded out scammers and time wasters. Both sides could trust that they were dealing with serious people. It sounded reasonable enough, almost legitimate. There was a button at the bottom, Apply for Access. I clicked it, not really intending to follow through, just curious about what the application process looked like. A form appeared. It asked for basic information: age, location, occupation, reason for seeking access. There were fields for providing an anonymous email address and uploading what they called verification materials. The instructions explained that applicants needed to prove they were real people with legitimate reasons for using the service. This could include professional credentials, references from existing users, or other documentation that demonstrated trustworthiness. The whole thing had this odd air of professionalism about it, like a job application or a membership form for an exclusive club. I suppose that's what made me fill it out. It felt harmless enough. I put down my real age and occupation, said I was from Newcastle, and wrote something vague about needing research assistance for design projects. Then I created a temporary email address and submitted the form without attaching any verification materials. I closed the browser and forgot about it. 3 days later, I remembered to check the temporary email account. There was one message waiting from an address that was just a string of random numbers and letters. The subject line said, "Application status. Additional information required." The message was brief and formal. It thanked me for my application and explained that they needed additional verification before they could grant access. Specifically, they wanted proof of identity, not a real name or official documents, but something that proved I was who I claimed to be. They suggested uploading a photograph of myself holding a piece of paper with my anonymous email address written on it, along with a photo of my current location or workspace. It seemed odd, but not unreasonable. They wanted to confirm I was a real person, not a bot or a scammer. I could understand that, and it wasn't asking for anything particularly sensitive. Just a photo. I took a quick picture on my phone. Me sitting at my desk in the flat, holding up a piece of paper with the email address scrawled on it. You could see part of my living room in the background, the sofa, the window, some of my design work pinned to the wall. Nothing that identified me or my exact location, but enough to prove I was real. I uploaded the photo and sent it back. 2 days later, another email arrived. This one said, "Verification successful. Access granted. Welcome to the vetted list." There was a link at the bottom. When I clicked it, I was taken back to the site, but now I could see more. The directory was extensive, dozens of categories, each containing listings for various services. Some were innocuous: document translation, data recovery, genealogy research. Others were more questionable: background checks, surveillance assistance, location tracking. Each listing included a brief description of the service, a rating based on previous users' feedback, and a contact method. Most used anonymous email or encrypted messaging. I clicked through a few out of curiosity, not intending to actually contact anyone. Then I noticed something at the top of the page, a notification. It said, "You have one pending request." I clicked on it. A message appeared, sent from another user on the platform. It was addressed to me, or rather, to my account. The message was short. "Saw your profile. Interested in working with you. Let me know if you're available." I hadn't created a profile. I'd only submitted an application. But apparently, the process of getting verified had also created some kind of user profile that others could see. I looked for a way to view my own profile and found it under account settings. What I saw made my stomach drop. My profile included the photo I'd sent. Me at my desk, holding the paper with the email address. But it also included information I definitely hadn't provided. My full name. My actual name, not some anonymous username. My address in Jesmond, complete with postcode. My phone number. My workplace, including the name of the agency and the address of our office. Underneath all that was a brief description. Graphic designer, Newcastle. Verified user. Available for consultation. I stared at the screen, trying to work out how they'd gotten this information. I hadn't given them my name. I hadn't given them my address or phone number. I'd been careful, anonymous. But somehow, they'd connected me to my real identity anyway. I looked at the photo again, the background, my living room. There were details visible if you looked closely. A piece of mail on the coffee table, too blurry to read but clearly there. A frame print on the wall, something I'd designed myself for a client. My laptop, partially visible on the desk. Small things, individually meaningless, but together, they'd reverse searched me. Or maybe facial recognition. Or maybe they'd traced the temporary email somehow, linked it back to my actual accounts. I didn't know how they'd done it, but they had. They'd taken the information I'd voluntarily provided and used it to uncover everything else. I immediately tried to delete my account. There was an option in the settings, but when I clicked it, an error message appeared. Account deletion requires admin approval. Request submitted. I closed the browser and sat there feeling sick. I'd been so careful, or so I'd thought. Anonymous email, no real information, just a harmless photo. And they'd used it to identify me completely. The next day, I received another email. Different address, but the subject line made it clear it was from the vetted list. Account deletion request denied. The message explained that accounts could only be deleted under specific circumstances. Users who had completed transactions could request deletion after a waiting period. Users who had never engaged with the platform had to wait 30 days before deletion was permitted. This was to prevent abuse of the system. I hadn't engaged with anyone. I hadn't used any services. I just looked around. But apparently, that wasn't enough. I had to wait. I tried to ignore it. I didn't go back to the site. I didn't check the messages. I just tried to pretend it hadn't happened. Then, about a week later, something strange occurred. I was walking home from work one evening, the usual route through Jesmond, when I noticed someone walking behind me. A man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark coat. Nothing unusual about him. But he stayed behind me for several streets, matching my pace. When I turned onto my road, he turned too. When I reached my building, he stopped across the street and took out his phone. I went inside quickly, glancing back through the door before it closed. He was still there, standing on the pavement, looking at his phone, or looking at my building. I couldn't tell. I went up to my flat and looked out the window. He was gone. I told myself I was being paranoid. Newcastle wasn't a small city. People walked the same routes, stood on the same streets. It didn't mean anything. But then it happened again. A few days later, different person. A woman this time, younger, standing outside the building when I came home from the shops. She wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing there looking at her phone. But when I went inside, I watched from the window, and she stayed there for another 10 minutes before walking away. Then someone came into the agency, a man I'd never seen before, asking to speak to me specifically. The receptionist told him I was in a meeting and asked if she could take a message. He said no, he'd come back. He never did. Emma noticed I was anxious. I told her I was stressed about work, about a difficult client. She believed me. Why wouldn't she? I went back to the vetted list. I had to know what was happening. I logged into my account and checked the messages. There were dozens now, all from different users, all saying variations of the same thing. Available for work. Can help with your project. Let me know what you need. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't requested anything. But apparently, my profile was visible to other users, and they thought I was offering services, or looking for them. I couldn't tell which. Then I saw something else. My profile had been updated. The description now included additional information. Specializes in visual verification and documentation. Can provide detailed observations and reporting. I hadn't written that. Someone else had edited my profile. The site administrators, presumably. They decided what kind of services I was offering, based on God knows what. I sent a message to the site support, demanding they delete my account immediately. The response came within an hour. Your profile has generated interest from verified users. Deletion at this time would violate platform terms. Please wait until engagement period expires. Engagement period, like I was a product they were marketing. I stopped going to work, called in sick. Emma was worried, kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't tell her. How do you explain that you accidentally signed up for something on the dark web and now people might be watching you? It sounded insane. Then someone knocked on my door. Middle of the afternoon, Emma was at work. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. Average height, average build, wearing ordinary clothes. He knocked again, then checked his phone, then knocked a third time. I didn't answer. I stood there, completely still, barely breathing, until he finally left. I checked the vetted list again that evening. There was a new message, sent from the same account that had first contacted me weeks earlier. Confirmed your location. Ready to proceed when you are. Proceed with what? I hadn't agreed to anything. I hadn't engaged with anyone. I just submitted a stupid application and uploaded a stupid photo. I replied to the message. Wrong person. Delete my account. Leave me alone. The response came quickly. You created the profile. You submitted verification. You're on the platform now. That's how it works. I asked what they wanted from me, what they thought I'd agreed to. The response, observation services. That's what your profile says. People need eyes in Newcastle. You're local. You're verified. You're available. I wrote back that I'd never agreed to provide any services, that I'd only been curious, that this was all a mistake. The response, doesn't matter. You're verified now. Other users have paid for access to your services. You need to fulfill the request or face penalties. Penalties? What did that even mean? I asked what kind of requests, what they expected me to do. The response included a list, addresses in Newcastle and the surrounding areas, specific locations I was supposed to visit and photograph, times I was supposed to be there, people I was supposed to watch and document, all presented like a work schedule, like a list of deliverables for a project. I didn't respond. I closed the laptop and sat in my flat with all the lights off, curtains drawn, trying to work out what to do. Going to the police felt impossible. What would I tell them? I accessed the dark web and accidentally signed up for something illegal. They'd probably arrest me, or laugh at me, or both. The next day, Emma found me sitting in the dark. She'd come home from work early, worried because I hadn't been answering her calls. She turned on the lights and saw me there, still in yesterday's clothes. Laptop closed in front of me. She asked what was happening. She said I was scaring her. She said if I didn't tell her what was wrong, she was going to call my parents, or a doctor, or someone who could help. So I told her, not everything, but enough. I said I'd been looking at something online I shouldn't have been, that I'd given away information I shouldn't have given, that people were contacting me now, asking me to do things I didn't want to do. She asked if it was illegal. I said I didn't know. She asked if I was in danger. I said I didn't know that either. She wanted to go to the police. I told her we couldn't. She didn't understand why, but she trusted me enough not to push it. We decided to leave. Just pack up and go. Stay with her parents for a while, or find a new flat somewhere else, somewhere these people couldn't find me. It seemed like the only option. We spent that evening packing essentials, planning to leave first thing in the morning. Emma went to bed around 11. I stayed up, watching the windows, checking the street below every few minutes. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Leaving won't help. You're verified. We know where you go." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, lights off, watching the street. Nobody came. Nothing happened. But the message sat on my phone like a weight. We left anyway. Went to her parents' place in Durham. I worked remotely for a few weeks. Told my boss I had a family emergency. Emma's parents asked questions, but Emma covered for me. said I was dealing with some personal issues and needed space. I didn't check the vetted list during that time. I didn't look at my email. I just tried to pretend it had all gone away. But after a month, I had to go back to work, back to the flat. We couldn't hide at her parents' house forever. So we returned to Newcastle, and I went back to the agency, and everything seemed normal, except it wasn't. Small things kept happening. Mail going missing. Someone ringing our buzzer late at night, then no one being there when we checked. My bike, which I kept locked in the building storage area, moved to a different spot. Tiny things, easy to dismiss individually, but they kept happening. Then one morning, I found an envelope under my door. Inside was a printed sheet of paper. It showed my profile from the vetted list, complete with my photo, my information, and that description I hadn't written. At the bottom, handwritten in red pen, someone had written, "Still waiting." Emma saw it before I could hide it. She demanded to know what it meant, who had left it, what I'd gotten us involved in. I told her everything then, the whole story, the application, the photo, the verification process, the requests, all of it. She was furious, not just scared, but genuinely angry that I'd been so stupid, so careless. She said we needed to go to the police, consequences or not. I agreed. We went to the station that afternoon, told them the whole story, showed them the envelope, explained about the site and the profile and the people watching us. The officer who took our statement was patient, professional. He said they'd look into it, but he also said that dark web cases were complicated, difficult to investigate, hard to prove. He said we should be careful, change our locks, maybe install a camera, stay alert, but he couldn't promise anything would come of the report. Nothing did. Weeks passed. The police called once to say they were still investigating, but they hadn't found anything concrete. The site still existed. My profile was still there, and the small incidents kept happening. Eventually, we moved, left Newcastle entirely. Emma got a job in Edinburgh, and I went with her. New flat, new city, new routines. We told people we'd wanted a change, a fresh start. We didn't mention the real reason. It's been almost 2 years now. We're still in Edinburgh. Emma's doing well at her new job. I'm freelancing, working from home, avoiding offices and regular commutes where someone could track my movements. I haven't accessed the dark web since. I deleted all the software, changed all my passwords, got rid of that laptop entirely and bought a new one. My profile on the vetted list is probably still there. I have no way to check without going back, and I'm never going back. But sometimes I'll see someone on the street who seems to be watching me, or I'll notice the same car parked outside our building on multiple days, or I'll find something small out of place in our flat, something I'm sure I didn't move, and I'll wonder if they're still tracking me. If being verified is something you can never undo. If somewhere on that site, my profile is still active, still telling people I'm available, still providing my current location to anyone who pays for the information. Emma doesn't know I still worry about this. She thinks we left it all behind in Newcastle. And maybe we did. Maybe I'm just paranoid now, seeing threats where there aren't any. But I don't think so. I think when you give people access to your identity, when you let them verify who you are and where you are, you can never really take that back. It's out there, permanent, waiting for someone to use it. I was right about one thing at least. Bad things do happen to people who make stupid decisions. I just didn't realize I was one of those people until it was too late. I remember it like it was yesterday. Though it's been 8 months since I found the laptop hidden behind the water tank in our loft and discovered that the man I'd been married to for 6 years wasn't who I thought he was. David and I had what everyone considered a stable relationship. We'd met through mutual friends in Manchester, moved in together after about a year, got married 3 years later in a small ceremony that felt perfect for both of us. He worked in logistics for a mid-sized company. I taught primary school. Ordinary jobs, ordinary lives, the sort of comfortable domesticity that most couples aspire to. We lived in a Victorian terrace in Chorlton that we'd bought together, splitting the mortgage payments and household responsibilities in ways that felt fair and sustainable. David handled most of the practical stuff, bills, maintenance, the technical side of running a household, while I focused on the social aspects like keeping in touch with friends and family. It was a good arrangement that worked well for both our personalities. David was naturally private and preferred dealing with systems rather than people, while I enjoyed the interpersonal side of life that he found draining. We complemented each other in ways that made the relationship feel balanced and secure. The only thing that occasionally bothered me was how secretive David could be about his computer activities. Not suspicious secretive, just protective of his digital space in ways that seemed excessive for someone with nothing to hide. Separate user accounts, passwords I didn't know, laptops that he'd close when I entered the room. He explained it as work-related confidentiality requirements and general preference for privacy, which seemed reasonable enough. I had my own phone and computer for personal use, and it's not like I needed access to his devices for any practical reason. But after 6 years of marriage, the casual secrecy started feeling less like reasonable boundaries and more like active concealment, especially when he'd receive messages at odd hours that would make him immediately reach for his phone with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to routine work communication. The discovery happened by accident while I was looking for Christmas decorations in the loft. David was away for a few days on a work trip, and I decided to get the house ready for the holidays while he was gone. The decorations were stored in boxes near the water tank, and while moving them, I knocked over a small holdall that I'd never seen before. Inside the holdall was a laptop I didn't recognize. Not David's work machine or the personal computer he used downstairs, but a third device that he'd apparently been keeping hidden from me. It was password protected, but David had always been predictable with passwords, variations on dates and names that were significant to our relationship. I shouldn't have tried to access it, should have put it back where I'd found it and pretended I'd never seen it. But curiosity got the better of me, especially when the password turned out to be a combination of our wedding date and my middle name. The desktop contained folders with names that immediately made me uncomfortable. Video files, streaming software, communication applications I'd never heard of. Nothing obviously illegal at first glance, but arranged in ways that suggested activities David had never mentioned to me. One folder contained what appeared to be technical documentation for broadcast equipment, cameras, lighting, audio recording devices. Professional quality gear that would cost thousands of pounds and wasn't the sort of thing David had ever shown interest in owning. Another folder contained correspondence with people using usernames rather than real names, discussing technical aspects of streaming and content creation. The conversations were carefully worded, but clearly referred to activities that weren't entirely legal or socially acceptable. The third folder contained video files that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the list. Recordings of what appeared to be live streams, showing dark rooms with industrial equipment and bound figures, the sort of content that explained why David had been keeping this laptop hidden. I opened one of the files and immediately understood that I was looking at something David had created rather than just downloaded. The camera work was deliberate and professional. The lighting was carefully arranged, and in the background I could hear David's voice giving instructions to someone off camera. The video showed a basement space that I'd never seen before, but with architectural details that suggested it was local rather than foreign. British electrical fittings, building materials that were common in the UK, background sounds that seemed typically Manchester. Most disturbing was the casual way David spoke during the recording. Not the voice of someone being forced to participate in criminal activity, but someone who was clearly in control and experienced with this type of content creation. I closed the file and sat in the loft trying to process what I'd discovered. The man I'd been married to for 6 years, who taught me to drive and remembered my birthday and helped me mark schoolwork in the evenings, was apparently creating violent content for audiences on hidden parts of the internet. Over the next few hours, I went through more of the files and correspondence on the laptop. The scope of David's activities was larger than I'd initially realized. Multiple locations, regular scheduling, sophisticated technical setup. This wasn't occasional dabbling in extreme content. It was a substantial ongoing activity that he'd been maintaining throughout our relationship. Some of the correspondence included references to participants and locations that made it clear David wasn't working alone. He was part of a group that shared resources and expertise. Though the communications were careful never to use real names or specific geographic details, what bothered me most wasn't just the criminal nature of what David was doing, but the systematic way he'd been concealing it from me. Separate bank accounts I'd never known about, rental agreements for properties I'd never visited, equipment purchases that hadn't appeared on our joint financial statements. He'd been living a completely separate life that required significant time, money, and planning. The sort of elaborate deception that takes years to establish and maintain without detection. I put the laptop back where I'd found it and spent the rest of the day trying to decide what to do with what I'd discovered. Reporting David to the police would destroy our marriage and probably result in serious criminal charges. But continuing to live with someone who created violent content felt impossible now that I knew what he was capable of. When David returned from his work trip, I tried to act normally while observing him more carefully than I'd ever done before, looking for signs of the person I'd seen in those recordings, trying to reconcile the loving husband I thought I knew with someone who spent his free time creating content that most people would find horrifying. He seemed exactly the same as always, affectionate, considerate, interested in my work and our shared plans for the future. If I hadn't seen the evidence myself, I'd never have suspected he was involved in anything more disturbing than occasional overtime at his logistics job. But I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The times when he worked late or went out for drinks with colleagues whose names he never mentioned. The phone calls he'd take in another room. The messages that arrived at unusual hours. Most unsettling was realizing how much of our life together had been structured around David's hidden activities without me recognizing it. Weekends when he'd encourage me to visit friends or family while he stayed home to catch up on work. Evening plans that would be cancelled at short notice because something urgent had come up. I'd always assumed he was just busy with legitimate work responsibilities. Now I understood that he'd been managing our relationship around his criminal activities, ensuring I wouldn't be present when he needed to focus on content creation. About 2 weeks after discovering the laptop, I decided to follow David when he said he was going out for drinks with work colleagues. Not because I wanted to confront him, but because I needed to understand the scale of what he was involved in. He drove to an industrial area on the outskirts of Manchester, parking outside a warehouse that looked abandoned from the road, but there were other cars in the car park. and lights visible through windows that had been covered from inside. I watched from a distance as David let himself into the building with his own key, suggesting he had regular access to the property. Other people arrived over the next hour, all entering the same way, all behaving like they were attending a routine business meeting. That's when I realized David wasn't just creating violent content. He was running some kind of organized activity that involved multiple people and significant infrastructure. The warehouse, the equipment, the regular schedule suggested something much more substantial than I'd initially understood. I drove home and spent the evening researching what I could find online about the type of content David was creating. Most sources dismissed red rooms as internet mythology, but a few seemed to have genuine knowledge about how such activities might function in practice. The technical requirements, legal risks, and financial resources needed to maintain live violent streaming were considerable. David would need partners with complementary skills, multiple secure locations, and sophisticated methods for avoiding detection by law enforcement, which meant the mild-mannered logistics worker I'd been married to was actually involved in running what amounted to a criminal enterprise, with all the risks and complications that implied for anyone connected to him. Over the next few weeks, I found myself becoming increasingly paranoid about our safety and my own legal liability. If David's activities were discovered by police, would I be considered an accomplice for having lived with him? Would our shared finances implicate me in funding criminal activities? More immediately, I was worried about what David might do if he discovered that I knew about his hidden life. The violence I'd seen in those recordings demonstrated he was capable of extreme actions when the situation required it. I started making preparations to leave without telling David directly what I'd discovered. Opening my own bank account, researching rental properties, making excuses to spend more time away from home, building the foundation for escape while trying to maintain the appearance of normal married life. But David wasn't stupid, and after 6 years of marriage, he knew my habits well enough to notice changes in my behavior. He started asking questions about why I seemed distracted, whether something was bothering me, if there were problems with work or our relationship. I tried to deflect his concerns with vague references to stress and tiredness, but his questions became more specific and persistent, as if he suspected I'd discovered something that explained my change in attitude, but wasn't sure exactly what I knew. One evening, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about making some changes to his work situation, maybe taking on different responsibilities that would require less travel and evening commitments, spending more time at home with me. The conversation felt like a test to see how I'd react to the prospect of David being around more often, whether I'd welcome the increased time together or seem uncomfortable with the idea of closer observation. I tried to respond positively while internally panicking about what it would mean to have David monitoring my activities more closely while I was planning to leave him. That night, I couldn't sleep for thinking about the trapped feeling of being married to someone who created violent content for entertainment and who might become violent himself if he felt threatened by exposure. The next morning, I found that the laptop in the loft had been moved, not obviously disturbed, just positioned slightly differently than I'd left it after my initial discovery, as if someone had checked to see whether it had been accessed recently, which meant David knew I'd found it, knew I'd seen the evidence of his activities, and was now deciding what to do about my knowledge. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching emergency accommodation and legal advice for people in dangerous domestic situations. But how do you explain to support services that your husband isn't physically abusive, but creates content that demonstrates he's capable of extreme violence against strangers? That evening, David came home with flowers and suggestions for a weekend away together. A romantic trip to the Lake District, just the two of us. No distractions from work or technology. The offer felt like an ultimatum disguised as a romantic gesture. Either accept that our marriage would continue as if nothing had changed, or face consequences that I wasn't prepared to contemplate. I told him the weekend away sounded lovely and started planning how to disappear before we were supposed to leave together. But I'm still here, 8 months later, sleeping next to someone who smiles when he kisses me goodnight and creates violent content in hidden locations during his free time. Because leaving would mean acknowledging what I know, and acknowledging what I know would mean accepting that the last 6 years of my life were built on foundations I never understood. And because I'm not sure someone who's invested this much time and effort in maintaining a secret life would simply let me walk away with knowledge that could destroy everything he's built. Picture this. You're sitting in your kitchen on a Thursday morning, still in your dressing gown, when someone knocks on your door with a package you never ordered. The delivery driver seems normal enough, checks your name and address twice, and hands over a box that's heavier than it looks. You sign for it without thinking, because that's what you do when packages arrive. Except I should have been more careful. I should have asked more questions, checked the sender details, maybe even refused to accept it. But I was half asleep and running late for work. So I just scrawled my signature on the electronic pad and took the box inside. It was addressed to me, complete with my full name and postcode, but there was no return address or company logo anywhere on the packaging. Just a plain brown box with a shipping label that looked like it had been printed at home rather than by a proper courier service. I left it on the kitchen table while I got ready for work, thinking I'd deal with it when I got home. My job at the insurance office in Northampton doesn't exactly leave much time for personal admin during the day, and I had a meeting first thing that I couldn't afford to be late for. The box sat there all day, and by the time I got home that evening, I'd almost forgotten about it. It wasn't until I was making dinner that I remembered the delivery and decided to see what was inside. The contents were nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the usual online shopping mistake or misdirected package, I found a mobile phone I'd never seen before, along with a charger and what looked like a set of printed instructions. The phone was an older model, probably a few years out of date, but it had been completely reset to factory settings. When I turned it on, there were no contacts, no installed apps beyond the basic ones, and no indication of who it had belonged to previously. The instructions were more concerning. They were handwritten on plain paper, explaining how to access something called a private communication system using the phone. The writing was clear and methodical, like someone had taken time to make sure every detail was correct. According to the instructions, the phone had been specially configured to connect to certain areas of the internet that weren't accessible through normal means. The writer explained that this would allow secure communication with people who shared similar interests and concerns about privacy and government surveillance. This should have been the moment I threw everything in the bin and forgot about it. Any rational person would have recognized this as either a scam or something much worse. But I was curious, and the instructions made it sound like accessing these areas was perfectly legal and quite common among people who cared about digital privacy. I'd been following news stories about data breaches and corporate surveillance for months, so the idea of finding more secure ways to communicate online didn't seem completely unreasonable. The phone appeared to be a way of connecting with like-minded people who had similar concerns about online privacy. I followed the instructions that evening. more out of curiosity than any real intention to get involved in whatever community the phone was meant to connect me with. The setup process was simpler than I'd expected, requiring just a few specific settings changes and the installation of an app that wasn't available through normal channels. Within an hour, I had access to what the instructions described as a private forum, where people discussed topics that they couldn't safely explore on mainstream social media. The conversations I could see seemed to focus on legitimate concerns about surveillance, corporate data collection, and government overreach. Most of the participants appeared to be ordinary people who had become worried about their online privacy and were looking for ways to communicate without being monitored. Teachers, shop workers, office staff, people with normal jobs and everyday concerns who had simply become more conscious of how much personal information they were sharing online. The discussions were more sophisticated than typical social media conversations, with people sharing detailed information about privacy tools, security practices, and ways to avoid unwanted attention from authorities or corporations. Nothing obviously illegal or threatening, just a community of people who valued their privacy more than most. I started reading the forum regularly over the following weeks, learning about various tools and techniques for maintaining anonymity online. The information was genuinely useful, and I began implementing some of the suggested privacy practices in my own internet usage. Some of the participants reached out to me directly, welcoming me to the community and offering advice about online security. These private conversations were friendly and helpful, with people sharing their experiences of avoiding surveillance and protecting their personal information. One contact in particular seemed especially knowledgeable about privacy tools and techniques. They offered to provide additional resources that weren't suitable for sharing in the main forum, explaining that some information was too sensitive to discuss openly even in private communities. This person sent me links to other areas of the internet where more advanced privacy advocates shared information and resources. They explained that these areas required additional security measures to access, but that the information available was much more comprehensive than what could be safely discussed in more accessible forums. I followed their recommendations and gained access to several other communities where the discussions were more detailed and technical. The participants in these areas seemed to have deeper knowledge of surveillance techniques and more sophisticated approaches to avoiding detection. The conversations in these communities revealed information about corporate and government monitoring that was much more extensive than anything I'd seen in mainstream news reports. People shared evidence of surveillance programs that hadn't been publicly acknowledged, along with techniques for identifying and avoiding various forms of monitoring. This information was disturbing, but it also felt important. I was learning about surveillance practices that affected everyone, but which most people were completely unaware of. The knowledge was empowering, giving me tools to protect my privacy that I never would have discovered through normal means. But somewhere around the 6th week, the nature of the information being shared began to change. Instead of general privacy advice and surveillance awareness, people started discussing more specific situations and individuals. Some participants shared detailed information about people they suspected of being involved in surveillance activities, not government agents or corporate spies, but ordinary people who they believed were monitoring their communities on behalf of authorities. These discussions included personal details about suspected informants, their real names, addresses, employment information, and daily routines. The level of detail suggested that extensive research had been conducted into these people's private lives. When I asked about the source of this information, I was told that community members conducted their own surveillance of people they suspected of infiltrating their groups. They explained that this was necessary for security, and that anyone who valued privacy needed to be aware of potential threats in their local area. I was given access to files containing surveillance reports on dozens of people across the country. These reports included photographs, address histories, employment records, and detailed information about social connections and daily routines. The reports were professional in their thoroughness, suggesting that whoever was conducting this surveillance had significant resources and expertise. They covered people in various locations and circumstances, from small towns to major cities, across a wide range of ages and backgrounds. What made these reports particularly unsettling was that many of the people being surveilled appeared to be completely ordinary individuals with no obvious connection to law enforcement or government agencies. Shop assistants, delivery drivers, retirees. People whose only apparent crime was living or working near someone who had become suspicious of their activities. When I raised concerns about the ethics of surveilling innocent people, the response was that determining innocence required investigation. The community's position was that anyone could potentially be involved in surveillance activities, and that protecting privacy required vigilance about everyone in their environment. I was encouraged to contribute to these surveillance efforts by providing information about people in my local area who might pose security risks to the community. They suggested starting with neighbors, work colleagues, or anyone who had shown unusual interest in my activities or conversations. This request made me deeply uncomfortable, but when I tried to reduce my participation in the community, I discovered that leaving wasn't as straightforward as I'd expected. The people I'd been communicating with began reaching out more frequently, expressing concern about my sudden change in activity levels. They explained that reducing participation after accessing sensitive information created security risks for the entire community. They needed assurance that I remained committed to protecting the privacy and safety of other members, which required continued engagement with community activities. When I tried to explain that I was simply losing interest in online privacy issues, they pointed out that my access to their surveillance reports had given me detailed information about their operations and the people they were monitoring. Withdrawing from the community while retaining this knowledge created an unacceptable security risk. The tone of these communications began to shift from friendly encouragement to more direct pressure. They reminded me that they had extensive information about surveillance techniques and resources, and suggested that people who pose security risks to the community often found themselves becoming subjects of surveillance rather than participants in it. To demonstrate their point, they sent me a file containing detailed information about my own activities over the previous 2 months. Photographs of me leaving and entering my flat, records of my work schedule, details about my shopping habits and social activities. The file included information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance of my daily routine. They knew where I worked, what time I typically left home, which shops I visited regularly, and who I spent time with socially. More concerning was evidence that they had access to my electronic communications beyond the private forum. They referenced conversations I'd had through my personal phone and email account, suggesting that their monitoring capabilities extended to my normal internet usage. The message accompanying this file explained that gathering this information had been a routine security check conducted on all new community members. They wanted to ensure that people accessing their resources were genuine privacy advocates, rather than infiltrators attempting to gather intelligence about their activities. They assured me that this surveillance would continue only as long as I remained a potential security risk to the community. Once I demonstrated ongoing commitment to their shared goals, the monitoring would be reduced to routine security checks rather than comprehensive surveillance. The implication was clear. I could continue participating in their surveillance activities against other people, or I could become a target of similar surveillance myself. Either way, my privacy was no longer my own to control. I realized that the phone delivery hadn't been random or mistaken. Someone had deliberately selected me as a potential recruit for their surveillance network, probably based on information they'd already gathered about my circumstances and vulnerabilities. The private forums and security information had been recruitment tools designed to draw people into increasingly invasive activities while normalizing surveillance as a necessary tool for protecting privacy. The irony was that protecting privacy required giving up privacy, at least for anyone who wanted to remain part of the community. I tried to return the phone and end all contact with the community, but discovered that they had backup methods for maintaining communication. Messages began appearing through my personal devices, and I received calls at work from people claiming to be conducting security checks on behalf of the community. The surveillance of my daily activities intensified, with increasingly obvious signs that my movements were being monitored and documented. Not threatening behavior, but clear demonstrations that they had comprehensive knowledge of my routine and social connections. This continued for several weeks, with regular reminders that my security status within the community remained unresolved. They suggested that relocating or changing jobs wouldn't necessarily improve my situation, since their surveillance capabilities weren't limited to my current location or circumstances. The pressure only ended when I moved to a different city and changed my phone number, email address, and most of my online accounts. Even then, I received occasional contact attempts for several months, suggesting that they were still attempting to re-establish communication. I never found out how they had initially identified me as a potential recruit, or how many other people had received similar packages and invitations to join their surveillance network. The whole operation was presented as grassroots privacy advocacy, but the resources and coordination required suggested something much more organized and well-funded. The most disturbing aspect was how reasonable their initial approach had seemed. Concerns about privacy and surveillance are legitimate, and many of their resources and techniques were genuinely useful for protecting personal information online. But their real purpose was recruiting people to participate in surveillance activities against their own communities, using privacy concerns as justification for invasive monitoring of innocent people's lives. I still don't know whether they were criminals, political extremists, or something else entirely. What I do know is that they understood how to exploit legitimate concerns about privacy to recruit people for activities they would never have agreed to if they'd understood the full scope from the beginning. The phone is probably still sitting in a drawer somewhere in my old flat, still configured to access their private communities and surveillance networks. I wonder, sometimes, how many other people have received similar packages, and how many of them were curious enough to follow the instructions without thinking about the consequences. Picture this. Someone knocks on your door with a package you never ordered, and you sign for it without asking questions. Sometimes the most dangerous deliveries are the ones that seem completely innocent. I'm sitting in a different flat now, in a different city, but I still find myself checking the locks twice before bed and keeping the curtains drawn during the day. It's been 8 months since everything happened, and I know I should probably just forget about it and move on. But I keep thinking about other people who might be in the same situation I was in. People who are desperate enough to ignore obvious warning signs because they need the money. The whole thing started in October last year, when the whole of Birmingham was having one of those miserable grey weeks where it never quite stops drizzling. I was spending most days in my bedsit near the city centre, watching the condensation run down the windows while I refreshed job search websites that never seemed to have anything new. I'd been unemployed for about 6 weeks by then, ever since the marketing agency where I worked decided to restructure their entire digital team out of existence. They'd given me a decent enough redundancy package, enough to cover rent and bills for a couple of months if I was careful, but finding replacement work was proving more difficult than I'd expected. The flat was starting to feel like a prison. The room consisted of a kitchenette in the corner, a small bathroom, and a view of the back of a Greggs across the road. I'd moved there straight after university because it was cheap and close to my job, thinking it would be temporary. 4 years later, I was still there, still telling myself I'd find somewhere better once my career got properly established. The redundancy had put an end to those plans. Now I was just trying to avoid having to move back in with my parents in Coventry, which felt like admitting defeat in a way I wasn't ready to accept. After 6 weeks of applications and interviews that went nowhere, I was getting genuinely worried about making next month's rent. That's when I started looking at freelance work, the sort of gig economy stuff I'd always thought was beneath my experience level. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: content writing for websites, social media management, basic design work. The pay was terrible and the clients were demanding, but it was better than nothing. I managed to scrape together enough small jobs to cover my immediate expenses, but it was exhausting and barely sustainable. Then I saw a listing that seemed too good to be true. Someone needed help with what they called content curation and verification for a research project. The pay was significantly better than anything else I'd seen, and the work seemed straightforward enough. The listing was posted on one of those freelance platforms that cater to more specialized work. Not the mainstream sites where you compete with hundreds of other applicants, but smaller communities where clients look for people with specific skills or experience. The job description was deliberately vague, which should have been a red flag. The client explained that they needed someone to review and categorize various types of digital content for academic research purposes. They emphasized that discretion was essential and that successful applicants would need to sign comprehensive confidentiality agreements. I applied without thinking too much about the details. The money was good enough to solve my immediate problems, and I convinced myself that academic research work would be more interesting than writing product descriptions for online retailers. The response came back within hours. The client wanted to arrange a phone interview, but insisted on using an encrypted communication platform rather than normal phone or video calls. They sent detailed instructions for downloading and setting up the software, along with explanations about why standard communication methods weren't suitable for their work. This should have raised my suspicions, but I was more concerned with the potential income than the unusual requirements. I told myself that academic research often involves sensitive information, and that using secure communication was probably just standard practice in their field. The interview took place that evening. The client's voice was distorted by the encryption software, making it impossible to determine their age, gender, or accent. They asked standard questions about my background and experience, but also probed into my personal circumstances in ways that felt slightly intrusive. They wanted to know about my living situation, whether I shared my workspace with anyone, how I handled confidential information in previous jobs. They seemed particularly interested in my financial situation and how urgently I needed work. I answered honestly about most things, including admitting that I was between jobs and needed income fairly urgently. Looking back, this was probably exactly what they wanted to hear. They offered me the position at the end of the call, subject to signing their confidentiality agreement and completing what they called a probationary assessment period. The pay would be transferred weekly, and all work would be conducted through secure channels similar to the interview platform. The confidentiality agreement arrived the next morning. It was longer and more detailed than anything I'd signed for previous jobs, with clauses about non-disclosure that seemed to cover not just the work itself, but any communication with the client or knowledge of their identity. More concerning were the sections about legal liability and indemnification. The language was complex, but it seemed to suggest that I would be personally responsible for any legal issues that arose from my work, and that the client would not provide support or representation if problems occurred. I nearly backed out at this point, but the financial pressure was overwhelming. I'd received another final notice about my rent, and I couldn't afford to wait for other opportunities to materialize. I signed the agreement and returned it the same day. Work began immediately. The client provided access to a private area of what they called their research database, along with detailed instructions for reviewing and categorizing the content I found there. The material was disturbing from the start, nothing obviously illegal, but the sort of content that exists in the darker corners of the internet, where normal social rules don't apply. Forums where people shared extremely personal information about their lives, communities built around unhealthy obsessions and compulsions. My job was to review this material and tag it according to various categories: the types of behavior being discussed, the apparent demographics of the participants, the level of detail being shared about real-world activities. It was like being a librarian for humanity's darkest impulses. The work was psychologically exhausting, but I told myself it was temporary, and that understanding these communities probably did have legitimate research value. I tried to maintain professional distance, treating it like any other content analysis job. The client communicated regularly through their encrypted platform, providing feedback on my categorization work and requesting additional detail about specific posts or conversations I'd reviewed. They seemed particularly interested in content that referenced real locations or identifiable details about the participants. After about 2 weeks, they began requesting additional information beyond what was visible in the posts themselves. They wanted me to research the usernames and posting patterns, looking for connections between different accounts and trying to identify repeated participants across multiple communities. This felt like crossing a line from content analysis into something more like surveillance. But when I raised concerns, the client reminded me of the confidentiality agreement and suggested that this level of analysis was standard for their type of research. They also mentioned that my probationary period was going well, and that they were considering offering me additional work at higher rates if I could demonstrate the thoroughness and discretion they required. The money was solving my immediate problems, and I convinced myself that tracking posting patterns was still within the bounds of legitimate research. I continued with the expanded requirements, though I found the work increasingly uncomfortable. Around the 3rd week, the client began asking me to focus on specific individuals whose posts had caught their attention. They provided detailed profiles of certain users, including information that clearly came from sources beyond the forums I was monitoring. These profiles included real names, addresses, employment details, and personal information that would have been impossible to gather from anonymous forum posts. It was obvious that the client had access to much more comprehensive surveillance capabilities than they'd initially suggested. When I asked about the source of this additional information, they explained that their research involved correlating online behavior with real-world data from various sources. They suggested that this was standard practice in modern social research, and that my role was simply to add context and analysis to data they'd already gathered through other means. This explanation made me deeply uncomfortable, but I was already involved enough to feel trapped. The confidentiality agreement made it clear that discussing the work with anyone else would result in serious legal consequences, and I couldn't afford the potential financial liability if I breached the contract. I continued working, but began documenting everything I was asked to do and keeping copies of all communications with the client. I told myself this was just prudent record keeping, but really I was starting to worry about what I might be contributing to. The turning point came when the client asked me to research someone whose online posts had mentioned my local area. They wanted me to identify real-world locations referenced in the posts and provide detailed information about the places and people mentioned. This was no longer abstract research about anonymous internet communities. I was being asked to help identify and potentially locate someone who lived in my own neighborhood, based on their private online activity. When I refused to continue with this specific task, the client's response was immediate and concerning. They reminded me that my contract included provisions for minimum performance standards, and that failure to complete assigned work could result in immediate termination and demands for repayment of previous payments. More troubling, they mentioned details about my own personal situation that I'd never shared with them. References to my financial difficulties, my living arrangements, even my daily routines, and the places I went for normal activities like shopping or socializing. It became clear that while I'd been researching other people, the client had been conducting similar research into my own life. They'd built up a comprehensive profile of my circumstances and vulnerabilities, presumably to ensure I would be motivated to continue working regardless of my comfort level. I tried to end the arrangement immediately, but discovered that extricating myself wasn't going to be straightforward. The client had structured the contract to make termination difficult, and they seemed prepared to use both legal pressure and personal intimidation to maintain my cooperation. They began sending me information about my daily activities that they couldn't possibly have gathered through normal online surveillance. Details about conversations I'd had in person, places I'd visited, people I'd met. The sort of information that suggested physical surveillance rather than just digital monitoring. This escalated over several days, with increasingly specific references to my movements and activities. Not direct threats, but clear demonstrations that they had comprehensive knowledge of my life and routine. I realized that I'd become as much a subject of their research as the people I'd been investigating. My online activity, personal circumstances, and psychological profile had been analyzed and catalogued just like the forum users I'd been researching. The irony was that I'd been helping them perfect techniques for gathering and correlating personal information, while simultaneously providing them with a detailed case study of how those techniques could be used to control and manipulate someone. I eventually managed to end my involvement by threatening to report everything to the police, though I knew that proving anything would be difficult given the way the client had structured our arrangement. The work had been presented as legitimate research, the payments were legal, and most of the surveillance could be explained as quality control or security measures. The clients seemed more amused than concerned by my threats, but they agreed to terminate the contract without pursuing the financial penalties they'd previously mentioned. Their final message suggested that my work had been useful for their research purposes and that they had sufficient data to continue without my participation. I never found out what the real purpose of the project had been, whether it was criminal surveillance, corporate espionage, government research, or just someone who enjoyed the power of cataloging and controlling other people's lives. What I do know is that the dark web communities I'd been studying were probably the least dangerous part of the entire arrangement. The real threat came from someone who understood how to exploit the legitimate-seeming freelance economy to recruit unwitting participants in activities they would never have agreed to if they'd understood the full scope. I've been more careful about employment opportunities since then, but I also know that my financial vulnerability made me an ideal target. Someone who needed money urgently enough to ignore warning signs and rationalize increasingly uncomfortable requests. The client was still receiving weekly reports about my activities and circumstances for months after our arrangement ended, based on the monitoring systems they'd established while I was working for them. I only realized this when I started noticing subtle signs that my routine was still being documented and analyzed. Moving house eventually solved the immediate surveillance problem, but I've never been entirely certain whether they lost interest or just became more discreet about their monitoring methods. The experience taught me that the most dangerous aspects of the dark web aren't necessarily the obviously criminal communities that everyone warns about. Sometimes the real threat comes from people who understand how to use legitimate-seeming arrangements to exploit the normal human needs for income and security. I still get occasional contact attempts through various platforms, offers for similar research work that probably come from the same client or their associates. The pay rates are always generous, the work descriptions are always vague, and the communication methods are always unnecessarily complex. I delete these messages immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have accepted similar offers without understanding what they were really agreeing to participate in. The strangest thing about finding yourself in the middle of a horror story is how ordinary everything feels right up until it doesn't. I'm a freelance graphic designer, nothing special, living in a cramped flat above a chip shop in Hackney. The kind of person who orders too much takeaway and falls asleep watching Netflix documentaries. Not exactly the sort you'd expect to stumble into something that would change everything. It started because of Danny, my flatmate's younger brother. He'd been staying with us for a few weeks after dropping out of university, much to his parents' horror. Danny was one of those lads who thought he knew everything about computers, but really just knew how to download things he shouldn't, and act smug about it. The kind who'd lecture you about privacy whilst posting every meal on Instagram. One evening in March, I came home to find Danny hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, looking pale as milk. He quickly shut the screen when I walked in, but not before I caught a glimpse of what looked like a chat room with dozens of messages scrolling past. Nothing unusual there, except Danny looked genuinely shaken, which was odd for someone who spent most of his time arguing with strangers online. Over the next few days, I noticed changes in him. He'd always been a bit of a night owl, but now he was staying up until dawn, emerging from his room only to grab food or use the bathroom. The bags under his eyes grew darker, and he jumped at every small noise. When I asked if he was all right, he just mumbled something about a project he was working on. The following week, Danny disappeared. Not dramatically, just packed his things whilst we were out, and left a note saying he'd decided to go travelling. His brother seemed relieved, honestly. Danny had been getting stranger by the day, barely speaking and spending all his time online. We assumed he'd finally sorted himself out and moved on. 3 months later, I was clearing out the spare room when I found Danny's old external hard drive wedged behind the radiator. Curiosity got the better of me. Most of it was the usual rubbish you'd expect from a 20-year-old, but buried in a folder labeled uni stuff were dozens of screenshots that made my stomach turn. The images showed what appeared to be a streaming interface, dark and minimal, with a video player displaying various rooms. Some looked like basements or warehouses, others like normal bedrooms or kitchens. Each stream had a viewer count and a chat sidebar filled with usernames I couldn't pronounce. The screenshots captured moments that looked disturbingly real. people in distress, sometimes alone, sometimes not. At first, I thought it might be some kind of elaborate horror game or interactive fiction, but the timestamps on the files suggested Danny had been accessing these streams regularly over several weeks. The final screenshot was dated just 2 days before he'd left, showing a room I recognized. It was his bedroom, taken from the angle of his webcam, but the image showed him sleeping, whilst the chat beside it was filled with messages about him. I should have deleted everything and forgotten about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Danny might be in trouble. After some research, I learned about the dark web and how to access it safely. I'm no computer expert, but I'm not completely hopeless either, and the instructions weren't as complicated as I'd expected. Finding the site again took weeks of searching through hidden forums and following cryptic links. When I finally located it, the interface was exactly as Danny's screenshots had shown. A grid of streams, each showing different locations, some with people, others empty. The viewer counts ranged from a handful to several hundred. The chat moved too quickly to read properly, a constant scroll of messages in multiple languages. I watched for hours, trying to understand what I was seeing. Most streams seemed to show people going about normal activities, unaware they were being watched. Cooking, reading, sleeping. It felt voyeuristic, but not necessarily sinister. Then I found the premium section. The premium streams required some form of verification I couldn't work out, but the preview thumbnails were enough to make me feel sick. These weren't people living their normal lives. These were deliberate performances, and not the kind anyone would volunteer for. One stream caught my attention because the location looked familiar. The room was sparse, with concrete walls and a single window set high up. It reminded me of the basement storage areas in council housing blocks, the kind where residents keep their Christmas decorations and broken furniture. As I watched, someone entered the frame, but the image quality was too poor to make out details. The chat beside this stream was different from the others. Instead of random messages, users seemed to be making requests or suggestions. I watched in horrifying fascination as these instructions appeared to be followed. The person in the room would move or act according to what the viewers demanded. Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn back to the site regularly. I told myself I was looking for clues about Danny, but really, I think I was just fascinated by the grotesque spectacle of it all. The streams never seemed to end, cycling through different locations and different people. Some faces appeared regularly, others only once. I started recognizing patterns. Certain usernames appeared in multiple chats, seeming to have influence over what happened. Some streams would suddenly cut to black, only to resume hours or days later with new occupants. The premium section grew, offering more extreme content for users who could prove their commitment to the community. The breakthrough came when I spotted Danny in one of the regular streams. He wasn't a victim, he was working behind the camera. I caught glimpses of him adjusting equipment, checking messages, sometimes speaking to people off-screen. He looked different, thinner and more focused, but it was definitely him. The realization that my flatmate's brother wasn't missing, but was actively involved in running these streams changed everything. I started paying closer attention to the technical side, trying to work out how the operation functioned. The streams appeared to be broadcast from multiple locations across the UK, possibly Europe, with sophisticated systems for avoiding detection. More disturbing was the discovery that many viewers weren't just passive observers. They were paying for influence, contributing resources, even providing locations and equipment. The whole thing operated like a twisted social network, with users building reputations and gaining access to more extreme content. I began documenting everything, taking screenshots and notes, thinking I might eventually take it to the police. But the more I learned, the more I realized how difficult that would be. The site was designed to be untraceable, the users anonymous, the evidence ephemeral. Even if authorities could locate the servers, they'd find nothing but empty rooms and abandoned equipment. Then one evening, whilst watching a stream from what looked like an abandoned warehouse in East London, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the background, barely visible through a grimy window, was the distinctive tower block where I lived. The camera angle suggested the warehouse was less than half a mile from my flat. I spent the next day walking around the industrial estate near my building, looking for anything that matched what I'd seen on screen. Most of the warehouses were still in use or had been converted to flats. But one building at the end of a dead-end road stood empty, its windows boarded up. That night, I watched the stream more carefully, looking for any details that might confirm the location. During a quiet moment, I heard something that made my chest tighten. Through the audio feed came the distant sound of the Northern Line trains pulling into the nearby station, the same sound I heard from my bedroom window every night. The warehouse was practically on my doorstep, and I'd been watching people being held there for weeks without realizing it. I should have called the police immediately, but something held me back. What if I was wrong? What if it was just coincidence? The streams operated on such a scale that surely law enforcement already knew about them. Maybe this was all part of some larger investigation I'd stumble into and compromise. Instead, I decided to take a closer look myself. Just to confirm the location, I told myself. Nothing more than that. The next evening, I walked past the warehouse several times, trying to look casual. The building appeared genuinely abandoned, with no signs of activity. But as I lingered near the entrance, I noticed something odd. Despite the boarded windows and general air of dereliction, there were fresh tire marks in the dirt near the loading bay. I was about to leave when I heard voices coming from inside the building. Low, conversational tones, too muffled to make out words, but definitely present. As I moved closer to try to hear better, my phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had sent me a private message on the streaming site. I'd never interacted with anyone there, never even created a proper account, so receiving direct contact was impossible. Yet there it was, a simple message that made my knees weak. The message contained just my full name and address, followed by a single line. "We appreciate dedicated viewers. Please step away from the building." I ran home faster than I'd moved since school sports day, my mind racing with questions about how they'd identified me, how long they'd known I was watching, what else they might have discovered about my life. Back in my flat, I immediately tried to access the streaming site again, but the link no longer worked. Every saved bookmark, every cached page, everything had vanished, as if it had never existed. Even Danny's screenshots from the hard drive were gone, leaving only empty folders. For days afterwards, I barely left the flat. Every noise in the hallway made me jump. Every unfamiliar face on the street seemed suspicious. I kept checking my phone for more messages, my laptop for signs of intrusion, but nothing came. Weeks passed, and gradually, I began to convince myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe the message had been a prank, or a coincidence, or even something I'd imagined in my paranoid state. The warehouse remained abandoned, with no signs of the activity I thought I'd witnessed. But then Danny came back. He appeared at our door one rainy Tuesday morning, looking exactly as he had when he'd left months earlier. Same clothes, same rucksack, even the same cocky smile. His brother welcomed him back without question, and life resumed as if nothing had happened, Except Danny was different now. He moved with purpose, carried himself with confidence, and seemed to know things he shouldn't. He'd ask about my work before I mentioned any projects, reference conversations I'd had with people he'd never met, make casual observations about my routines that felt too specific to be guesses. Most unsettling was the way he'd look at me sometimes, with expression that suggested he knew exactly what I'd been doing during his absence. Not accusatory, just aware, like we shared a secret neither of us would ever discuss. The warehouse at the end of the dead-end road was demolished last month, replaced by a small block of expensive flats. I walk past the construction site regularly, but there's no trace of what might have been there before. The workers I've spoken to say they found nothing unusual when they cleared the building, just the usual debris you'd expect from an abandoned property. Danny still lives with us, still spends hours on his laptop, still emerges from his room at odd hours, looking like he hasn't slept. But now, when I pass him in the hallway, he nods at me with something that might be respect, or acknowledgement, or warning. I never found another working link to the streaming site, though I suspect it's still out there, operating under different names, different systems, different faces. Sometimes, late at night, when the trains have stopped running and the chip shop below has closed, I think I can hear voices through the walls. Quiet conversations, muffled instructions, the soft hum of electronic equipment. But that might just be my imagination, shaped by weeks of watching things I should never have seen. The mind has a way of creating patterns where none exist, finding connections that aren't really there. At least, that's what I tell myself when I wake up at 3 a.m, convinced someone's been in my room whilst I was sleeping. The hum of the traffic outside my window was a constant, low thrum, a dull counterpoint to the silence within my flat. Portsmouth, a city that never truly slept, yet my own corner of it often felt like a tomb. I was David, 34, an insurance claims assessor. My days unfolded in a meticulous dance of paperwork, figures, and dispassionate assessments of other people's misfortunes. My evenings, however, were a different beast. They stretched out, vast and empty, often filled by the pale glow of a screen. It began, as most things do, with a search for something to fill the void. Not a conscious search, perhaps, more adrift. I found myself drawn to the fringes of the internet, the obscure forums, the corners where the unvarnished truth, or at least a convincing facsimile of it, was whispered. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a distraction from the quiet hum of my own unremarkable existence. Then I saw it, a link buried deep within a thread about urban legends and forgotten histories. The title was innocuous enough: Lost Footage, Portsmouth Docks. I clicked, a casual flick of the wrist, a momentary lapse in my usual caution. The video player loaded slowly, the buffering icon a mocking circle against the black screen. My flat, a converted Victorian building with walls so thin, I could sometimes hear the neighbour's television, felt colder suddenly. The flickering hallway light outside my door seemed to dim. The footage began, grainy, shaky, filmed vertically on what looked like an old mobile phone. The resolution was poor, but the content burned with an awful clarity. A room, it was dimly lit, a single bare bulb swinging slightly overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. There was a figure, indistinct, struggling. Another, larger, darker shape loomed over them. No sound, just the visual horror unfolding in jagged, stuttering frames. A muffled thud, a gasp that was more felt than heard. Then the sickening stillness. the larger shape moved away, leaving the first figure slumped, motionless. The camera dropped, and the screen went black. My breath hitched. The air in my lungs felt thick, heavy. This wasn't some special effect, some elaborate prank. The raw, visceral terror of it, the sickening sense of violation clung to the pixels. This was real, a real killing. I stared at the black screen, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My fingers, usually so steady, trembled as I navigated back to the forum. The thread was already several pages deep. Others had seen it. Their comments ranged from shock to morbid curiosity, some dismissing it as a fake, others demanding more information. I scrolled, my eyes darting across the anonymous usernames, the fragmented sentences. No one knew the source. No one knew who had uploaded it. Just a ghost in the machine. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The methodical part of my brain, the part that dissected insurance claims, that sought out anomalies and inconsistencies, kicked into overdrive. This wasn't some abstract problem. This was a violation, a life taken, and it was out there, floating in the digital ether, unpunished, unseen by the eyes that mattered. My quiet dissatisfaction, my boredom, curdled into something sharper, a desperate need for answers. I spent the next few days in a daze. The image of that dimly lit room seared into my mind. I re-watched the video countless times, pausing, zooming, trying to extract every scrap of detail. The furniture was sparse, almost bare. A worn armchair, a small low table, a pattern on the wallpaper, faint but distinct. My flat, with its impersonal atmosphere, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The constant hum of traffic outside seemed to mock the quiet claustrophobia indoors. I started digging. I delved deeper into the forum, then branched out, following breadcrumbs across encrypted archives and abandoned links. My sleep became fractured, haunted by the ghostly movements in the video. My work suffered, my mind adrift in a sea of algorithms and IP addresses. My flat, usually a place of quiet solitude, now felt like a command center, its single window a portal to a world I was desperate to penetrate. I found a user, shadow_echo, who had posted a cryptic message beneath the video. This is not the first. My fingers flew across the keyboard. What do you mean? I typed, the words feeling inadequate, clumsy. A pause, then a reply. Others exist, different angles, different victims. A chill snaked down my spine. Where? I demanded, my voice a whisper in the silent room. You have to know where to look, not for the faint of heart, and the conversation died there. Shadow Echo went silent, their digital footprint vanishing as quickly as it appeared. But the seed was planted. Different angles, different victims. The horror deepened, widened. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. My search became an obsession. I learned the language of the dark web, the protocols of anonymity. I bypassed firewalls, navigated proxy servers, my mind a relentless engine of inquiry. I found another video, then another. They were all similar. Low quality, dimly lit rooms, the same chilling act repeated with different faces, different settings, yet always with that same awful intimacy. But none of them had the same impact as the first. The first one, the one that had snagged my attention, still held a particular, unsettling grip. I kept returning to that first video, scrutinizing every pixel, the wallpaper pattern, the specific angle of the bare light bulb, the faint reflection in a window pane, hinting at the outside world. I started comparing it to my own flat, my own sparse furniture, my own worn armchair, my own low table. My heart began to thud, a slow, heavy beat. One evening, I paused the video, the image of that dimly lit room frozen on my screen. I stood up, walked to my living room, and looked around. The layout, the dimensions, the way the light fell from my own bare bulb, swinging slightly from the ceiling. A sickening realization began to dawn, a cold dread seeping into my bones. No, it couldn't be. I walked to the wall, my fingers tracing the faint pattern of the wallpaper. It was old, faded, a floral motif that had long since lost its vibrancy. I returned to the screen, zoomed in on the video. The pattern matched, identical. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the quiet room. I moved to the window. The reflection in the video, indistinct as it was, showed a glimpse of a red brick building opposite. My eyes darted across the street, the red brick building, the one directly across from my flat. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My vision blurred. This wasn't just a random video. This wasn't just a room. This was my room, my flat. My mind reeled. I had moved into this flat 6 months ago. The landlord, a jovial man named Mr. Henderson, had mentioned it had been empty for a few months before I took it. Needed a bit of a spruce up, he'd said, but a solid place. The video had to have been filmed before I moved in, months before. The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. I was living in a crime scene, sleeping in a room where a life had been brutally extinguished. The mundane objects around me, my books, my laptop, my half-empty mug of tea, suddenly felt tainted, imbued with a horrific past. The very air I breathed felt heavy, thick with unspoken terrors. I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief and mounting horror. I re-watched the video, not as a detached observer, but as a resident, an unwilling inheritor of its grim history. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, every flicker of the hallway light now carried a sinister echo. The quiet claustrophobia indoors became almost unbearable. I tried to rationalize it. It was just a flat, a building, bricks and mortar. But the image of that slumped figure, the silent struggle, refused to leave me. It had happened here, in this very space. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? I found a video of a murder in my flat on the dark web. The anonymity of the internet, the obscure forums, would make it impossible to trace. They would dismiss it, or worse, they would suspect me. My meticulous nature, my quiet life, would be picked apart, scrutinized. I had no evidence beyond the video itself, and a gut feeling that clawed at my insides. The illusion of control, once a comforting presence in my life, shattered. I had thought I was searching for truth, for order. Instead, I had stumbled into a world built on lies and faceless cruelty, a world that had now invaded my own sanctuary. I started looking for details in the video that I might have missed. Anything. A reflection of the killer, a piece of clothing, a distinctive sound, though the video was silent. My eyes, accustomed to dissecting minute details in insurance claims, now scoured every pixel for a clue. Then I saw it, in one brief, almost imperceptible frame, as the camera dropped, a glint, a metallic glint, reflecting the bare bulb. It was on the floor, near where the victim had fallen. Small, insignificant, easily missed. A ring. I zoomed in further, pushing the grainy image to its limits. The ring was simple, a silver band, but there was something on it, an engraving, a symbol. The resolution was too poor to tell. My heart pounded with a renewed sense of purpose. This was it, a physical lead, a tangible piece of the puzzle. I got down on my hands and knees, my face inches from the worn carpet in my living room. I crawled, slowly, meticulously, across the exact spot where the victim had fallen in the video. My fingers brushed against the fibers, searching, hoping. Nothing. The carpet was clean, vacuumed, impersonal. Whatever had been there, whatever small metallic glint, was long gone. The flat had been spruced up, Mr. Henderson had said. Cleaned, sanitized, all traces erased. A wave of despair washed over me. I was chasing ghosts, shadows in a digital realm, physical manifestations that had long since vanished. The silence of the flat pressed in on me, suffocating. The constant hum of traffic outside seemed to mock my futile efforts. Days bled into weeks. My life became a dual existence. By day, I was David, the methodical claims assessor, navigating the mundane world of policies and premiums. By night, I was a ghost hunter, replaying the video, obsessing over the details, trying to conjure the past into the present. I began to notice things, small things, a faint discoloration on the wall near the armchair, almost invisible, but there, if you look closely enough. A slightly deeper indentation in the floorboards beneath the carpet, as if something heavy had rested there for a long time. My imagination, once a dormant faculty, now painted vivid, terrifying pictures of what had transpired in this room. One night, the obsession reached a new peak. I had been staring at the video for hours, the dim light of the screen reflecting in my wide, bloodshot eyes. The victim's face, though blurred, began to coalesce in my mind. A young woman, her eyes, wide with terror, seemed to stare directly at me, accusingly. I felt a cold presence in the room, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The air thickened. The shadows in the corners of my living room seemed to deepen, to take on form. I could almost hear the muffled thud, the choked gasp. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I stood up, my legs wobbly. My gaze swept across the room, seeing it not as my home, but as it had been, a stage for horror. I walked to the armchair, the one I sometimes sat in to read. My hand reached out, tracing the worn fabric. Was this where she had been? Had her last moments been spent struggling against that very armrest? A guttural sound escaped my throat, a sob, a gasp, a cry of pure, unadulterated terror. I couldn't live here anymore. The flat, once a refuge, had become a prison. The walls, the floor, the very air were saturated with a past I could not escape. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, but who? My colleagues would think I was mad. My family, distant and disconnected, would dismiss it as a morbid fantasy. I scrolled through my contacts, my mind a blur. No one understood. My gaze fell upon the screen again. The video paused on that awful moment of stillness. The larger, darker shape, the killer. It was indistinct, but something about its posture, its build. A memory stirred, a fleeting image from a long-forgotten news report, a cold case, a series of disappearances in the area years ago, dismissed as runaways or unfortunate accidents. No bodies ever found. My mind, once so focused on the single video, began to connect the dots. Not the first, Shadow_Echo had said. Others exist. Different angles, different victims. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was something far more sinister, far more organized. A predator operating in the shadows, leaving behind only digital echoes of his gruesome work. I felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just about the flat anymore. It was about justice, about giving a voice to the voiceless, bringing light to the darkness. I couldn't go to the police with just a grainy video and a gut feeling. I needed more. I needed to understand the pattern. I needed to find the source. I returned to the forums, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a renewed intensity. I searched for every mention of shadow_echo, every cryptic post, every abandoned link. I delved into the deep web, pushing past my previous boundaries, my ethical considerations dissolving in the face of the overwhelming horror. The anonymity of the internet, once a shield, now felt like a veil, a deliberate obfuscation. I had to rip it away. I found another user, Cypher Ghost, who had interacted with Shadow Echo years ago. Their posts were even more cryptic, referencing the architect and the gallery. "You speak of an architect," I typed, my fingers ablur. "Who is he?" A long pause. The silence on the other end felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken knowledge. Then a reply. "He builds, he collects, he shares." "Shares what?" I demanded, my voice a whisper. "His art, his creations." My blood ran cold. Creations, the victims. Where can I find him? "You can't find him. He finds you." The message vanished. Cypher Ghost 2 went silent. My heart pounded. "He finds you." The words echoed in my mind, a terrifying premonition. Was I already on his radar? Had my relentless digging exposed me? I looked around my flat, the familiar objects now imbued with a new, chilling significance. The thin walls seemed to breathe. The flickering hallway light outside my door seemed to pulse like a dying heart. The hum of traffic outside, once a dull drone, now sounded like a distant, approaching roar. I was no longer a detached observer. I was part of the story. The hunter had become the hunted. Or perhaps I had always been the prey, lured into his web by the irresistible pull of the forbidden. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow was a lurking figure, every creak a footstep. I started leaving the lights on, a futile attempt to ward off the encroaching darkness. My once methodical life dissolved into a chaotic spiral of fear and paranoia. One evening, as I stared at my reflection in the darkened window, a chill snaked down my spine. The reflection was distorted, ghostly. And then, for a split second, I saw it. A figure standing behind me in the reflection. Tall, indistinct, a dark silhouette against the dimly lit room. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the empty room. The familiar furniture. The faint pattern on the wallpaper. My breath hitched. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. I was losing my mind. The obsession had consumed me, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. But the image in the reflection felt too real, too visceral. I backed away, stumbling, until my back hit the wall. My eyes darted around the room, searching, scrutinizing every corner. The air felt heavy, charged. Then a sound, a faint click, from the hallway. My blood ran cold. I hadn't locked the door. I rarely did. Portsmouth, for all its busyness, generally felt safe enough. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the hallway. It was tall, lean, a man. He stepped into the living room, his movements fluid, silent. His face was obscured by the dim light, but I could feel his gaze, cold and assessing. He wore a dark, unassuming jacket. His hands were bare. In one, he held something. A small, black object, a phone. My breath caught in my throat. This was him, the architect, the man who built, the man who collected, the man who filmed. "You found me," I managed to croak, the words barely audible. My voice, usually steady, was a ragged whisper. He didn't reply. He simply raised the phone, pointing it at me. The small red light on the camera lens glowed, a malevolent eye. My mind raced. This wasn't a warning. This was the next act. I was to be his next creation. Why? I asked, my voice gaining a desperate edge. Why do you do this? A low chuckle escaped his lips, a dry, rustling sound, devoid of humor. You seek truth, David, he said, his voice a low murmur, surprisingly calm. But truth is subjective. It's what we make of it. I simply document. He took a step closer. The lens of the phone seemed to magnify, to consume me. You've been a diligent student, he continued, his gaze unwavering. Following the breadcrumbs, unearthing the past. He gestured around the room with his free hand. This room, it has history. You felt it, didn't you? The echoes. My blood ran cold. He knew my name. He knew my thoughts. He had been watching me all this time. You filmed it here, I said, my voice trembling. In my flat. He nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. A good location. Anonymous. Easily forgotten. People come and go. The walls, they remember everything. He took another step. I could smell him now. A faint scent of stale smoke and something metallic, like old coins. My heart hammered, a drum solo of pure terror. But you, he said, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper. You remembered. You disturbed the peace. The phone was still pointed at me, its red eye glowing. He was filming me, my terror, my final moments. I had chased the truth, and the truth had found me. The illusion of control, of anonymity, had dissolved into this terrifying reality. My obsession had led me not to justice, but to my own grim end. The quiet hum of traffic outside seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding in my ears. The flickering hallway light outside my door seemed to dim, preparing for the final blackout. He moved quickly then, blurring into the shadows. I barely registered the glint of metal before a searing pain exploded in my chest. My legs buckled. The phone, still recording, captured the wide, terror-stricken eyes, the desperate gasp for air. My hands flew to the wound, warm, sticky blood gushing between my fingers. I fell, a muffled thud, onto the worn carpet. The room spun. The bare bulb overhead swung wildly, casting long, dancing shadows. The last thing I saw was the red light of the phone still pointed at me, still documenting, still collecting. The last thing I heard was the distant mocking hum of the traffic outside, a dull counterpoint to the silence within my flat. And then, only darkness. I never thought I'd be the type of person to stumble into something genuinely horrifying. Most people don't, I suppose. We go about our mundane lives assuming the worst things happen to other people in other places, never suspecting that horror might be actively seeking us out. It started with redundancy. After 8 years working for a marketing firm in Birmingham, I found myself suddenly unemployed thanks to corporate restructuring. The severance package was decent enough to keep me afloat for a few months, but job hunting in my field had become increasingly competitive. Every position attracted hundreds of applicants, and at 34, I was starting to feel like damaged goods in a market that seemed to favor fresh graduates. After 6 weeks of rejections and automated responses, I'd exhausted the mainstream job sites. That's when a mate from university mentioned he'd found freelance work through what he called alternative channels. Nothing dodgy, he assured me, just companies that preferred discretion and paid well for specialized skills. He wouldn't elaborate much, but he did give me a web address that looked nothing like the usual recruitment sites. The initial interface was surprisingly professional, clean, minimalist design, with a simple registration form. It asked for basic details, experience, skills, availability. Nothing seemed unusual until I reached the section about work preferences. Among the standard options like full-time, part-time, and contract work, there was something called performance-based assignments. The description was vague, mentioning client satisfaction and results-driven compensation. I ticked several boxes, including that one, and submitted my application. Within hours, I received an email with a link to what appeared to be a more detailed application process. This is where things became strange. The second form was extensive, asking increasingly personal questions. It wanted to know about my living situation, whether I lived alone, my relationship status, family connections. There were questions about my comfort level with confidential work, my discretion regarding client privacy, and whether I'd be willing to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Most oddly, it asked about my appearance, requesting recent photographs and basic physical statistics. I nearly abandoned the application at that point, but unemployment has a way of making you consider options you'd normally dismiss. I told myself this was probably for some sort of client-facing role that required specific presentation standards. The third stage involved a video interview, but not the kind I expected. Instead of speaking with a recruiter, I was asked to record myself answering a series of questions. The questions themselves were peculiar. They focused heavily on my ability to follow instructions precisely, my comfort with being observed, and my willingness to participate in projects that might seem unusual but were completely legal. One question particularly stuck with me. Describe a time when you did something you weren't entirely comfortable with because the compensation was worthwhile. I found myself being more honest than I'd intended, discussing some of the more questionable marketing campaigns I'd worked on in my previous job. A week passed without response. I'd almost forgotten about the application when I received a phone call from an unlisted number. The voice was professionally pleasant, but offered no company name or personal identification. They simply said I'd been selected for a trial assignment and asked if I was still interested. The pay they quoted was substantial, more than I'd earned in 3 months at my previous job, for what they described as a one-day commitment with possible ongoing opportunities. They couldn't provide details over the phone, they explained, due to client confidentiality requirements, but assured me everything was above board. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in central Birmingham. I was told to look for someone carrying a red folder and wearing a blue scarf. The whole thing felt like something from a spy film, but I was curious enough to go along with it. The person I met defied my expectations entirely. Rather than some shadowy figure, she was a well-dressed woman in her 40s who could have been anyone's aunt. Professional, articulate, and completely ordinary. She introduced herself as Sarah, though she mentioned that wasn't her real name, and apologized for the cloak and dagger approach. She explained that her organization facilitated what she called emotionally authentic live experiences for clients seeking genuine human connection. The work involved participating in specialized digital interactions that provided viewers with access to unfiltered personal moments. She emphasized that everything was legal, consensual, and that I would maintain complete autonomy over my involvement. The way she described it made it sound like some sort of therapeutic service, perhaps for isolated wealthy clients who craved authentic human interaction. She mentioned that traditional media had become too artificial, and there was growing demand for unscripted, genuine experiences. When I asked for more specifics, she became slightly evasive, saying that client requirements varied significantly and that each assignment was tailored to individual comfort levels. She did mention that the work took place in controlled environments with professional equipment, and that safety was their primary concern. What convinced me was the advance payment she offered, enough to cover my rent for 2 months just for agreeing to a trial session. If I decided not to continue after seeing what was involved, I could keep the money with no obligations. The location she gave me was an industrial estate on the outskirts of Coventry. The building looked like a converted warehouse, professionally maintained but unremarkable from the outside. Inside, it was surprisingly sophisticated. Multiple rooms equipped with professional lighting and camera equipment, all very clean and organized. I was introduced to what they called the technical team, 3 people who seemed competent and professional. They explained that I'd be participating in a live broadcast to a select audience, following simple instructions from a director. The scenario, they said, would involve me responding to audience requests in real time, but nothing that would make me genuinely uncomfortable. The room I was brought to looked like a cross between a television studio and a comfortable living space. There were cameras positioned at various angles, professional lighting, and a comfortable chair positioned in the center. A large monitor displayed what appeared to be a chat interface, though I couldn't read the text from where I sat. They fitted me with a small earpiece and explained that I'd receive instructions through it. The director would tell me what to do, and I should follow along naturally. They emphasized that if I became uncomfortable at any point, I could simply say so and the session would end immediately. As the session began, I could see numbers appearing on the monitor. What I assumed were viewer counts. The figures were higher than I'd expected, climbing into the hundreds. The director's voice in my earpiece was calm and professional, initially asking me to introduce myself using a fake name they'd provided. The first instructions were mundane. Stand up, walk around the room, describe what I was wearing. The audience seemed to be asking questions that the director relayed to me. Standard things like where I was from, what I did for work, whether I enjoyed being on camera. Gradually, the request became more personal. The director asked me to talk about my living situation, my relationships, my daily routine. I found myself sharing details about my unemployment, my loneliness, the financial pressures I was facing. Then came requests that made me slightly uncomfortable. I was asked to provide my address, my phone number, details about my neighbors. When I hesitated, the director explained that this was part of the service. Clients paid for authentic personal connections with performers. She assured me that all information was kept strictly confidential and used only to enhance the viewer experience. The session continued for about 2 hours, with me answering increasingly intimate questions about my life, my fears, my vulnerabilities. By the end, I felt drained but satisfied that I'd completed the assignment successfully. The audience numbers had grown significantly, and the director seemed pleased with my performance. I was paid immediately and told to expect follow-up sessions. The money was exactly what I needed, and despite feeling slightly unsettled by some of the questions, I agreed to consider future sessions. Over the next few days, I noticed small things that bothered me. A car I didn't recognize parked across from my flat several times. Phone calls that rang twice and stopped. An envelope in my mailbox with no return address, containing only a photo of me walking to the shops. When I called the number Sarah had given me, it was disconnected. The building in Coventry was empty when I drove out to check, with no signs that anyone had been there recently. It was only when I started researching online that I began to understand what I'd actually participated in. The term that kept appearing was Red Room, live broadcasts where audiences paid to watch real people in vulnerable situations. with the entertainment value coming from the subject's genuine distress and fear. I realized that everything I'd shared during that session, my address, my routine, my vulnerabilities, had been broadcast to an audience that wasn't looking for entertainment in any conventional sense. They were looking for someone isolated, financially desperate, and emotionally fragile. The follow-up contact came exactly a week later, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of a phone call or email, I found a note slipped under my door. It contained a single line. "Thank you for your application. The position is now permanent." That night, I noticed the car parked outside again, but this time I could see someone sitting in it, watching my windows. When I looked closer, I saw they were holding what looked like a high-end camera. I've been researching how to disappear completely, but I'm beginning to suspect it's too late for that. The audience I performed for wasn't just watching for entertainment. They were evaluating me for something much more permanent. The final confirmation came through a Reddit message from a throwaway account. Someone had sent me a link with a simple message. "Thought you should see this." The website was selling subscriptions to what it called ongoing lifestyle content. The preview thumbnail made my stomach drop. It was me sitting in my living room, photographed through my window. The monthly subscription price was higher than my old salary. I'm writing this from a hotel room in Manchester, but I don't think distance matters anymore. The internet has made geography irrelevant, and I've already given them everything they need to find me anywhere. The worst part is knowing that I applied for this myself, answered all their questions willingly, and provided them with a complete roadmap to my destruction. I was so focused on the immediate payment that I never considered what I was actually selling. If you're ever desperate enough to consider unconventional work opportunities, especially ones that seem too good to be true, please learn from my mistake. Some audiences aren't looking for performance, they're looking for victims. I probably shouldn't admit this, but I used to think I was smarter than most people. Not in an obnoxious way, I hope, but I had this quiet confidence that I could navigate situations others couldn't, work things out, stay a step ahead. Looking back now, that belief feels almost funny. Almost. This happened about 18 months ago, when I was living in Bristol and working as a copywriter for a marketing agency. Decent job, decent flat, decent life. Nothing extraordinary, but I was content enough. My evenings usually involved cooking something simple, maybe watching a series, occasionally meeting friends at the pub. Pretty standard existence for someone in their late 20s. I'd heard about the dark web the same way everyone has, through articles and documentaries that make it sound like this lawless digital wasteland full of hitmen and drugs and worse. But I'd also read enough to know that a lot of it was exaggerated, that plenty of it was mundane, even boring. Activists and journalists used it. People in countries with restricted internet access. It wasn't all horror stories. So when a colleague mentioned it one afternoon, talking about how you could find leaked databases and deleted information, I was curious. Not about anything illegal, mind you. I just wanted to see what was actually there, what all the fuss was about. I went home that evening and spent maybe half an hour getting set up. It was easier than I'd expected. A few simple steps, and I was browsing this completely different version of the internet. The first thing I noticed was how slow everything was. Pages took ages to load. Links were broken constantly. Most sites looked like they'd been designed sometime around the year 2000 and never updated. I spent an hour or so clicking around, finding mostly disappointment. Some marketplaces that looked obviously dodgy. A few forums discussing things I had no interest in. Nothing particularly shocking or exciting. Then I found a site called Request Exchange. It was buried in one of those directory listings, described simply as Community Service Platform. When I opened it, the page was plain. White background, black text, minimal formatting. At the top was a simple explanation. This was a place where people could post requests for information or tasks they needed completed, and others could fulfill those requests. Like a bizarre anonymous version of a freelancing site. The requests were strange. Someone wanted copies of building blueprints for an office complex in Leeds. Another person needed photographs of a specific car park in Edinburgh at different times of day. Someone else wanted detailed information about a particular person's daily routine, including where they worked and what time they left home. That one made me uncomfortable, obviously, but I kept scrolling. Most requests were vague enough that you couldn't tell if they were legitimate or sinister. Need access to email account. Could be someone trying to recover their own lost account, or someone planning something awful. Require footage from specific location. Could be a researcher or a stalker. The anonymity made everything feel slippery and uncertain. What caught my attention was how many requests were marked as completed. Each one had a status indicator, and dozens showed as fulfilled. Underneath those, there were sometimes comments. Anonymous users saying things like received, thanks, or perfect, exactly what I needed. It was active. People were actually using this. At the bottom of the page was a link, submit your request. I clicked it, not really thinking, just curious about what the process looked like. A form appeared, simple and straightforward. A text box for describing what you wanted. A field for providing an anonymous email address where responses could be sent. Optional fields for offering payment, though I noticed many requests left this blank. And a disclaimer at the bottom stating that the site took no responsibility for any requests or responses, that everything was entirely at the user's own risk. I sat there for a while, cursor blinking in the empty text box, wondering what I'd even ask for if I was going to submit something. I didn't need anything. I wasn't trying to track anyone down or obtain private information. I was just looking. Then, almost as a joke, I typed something. I can't even remember exactly what made me think of it, but I wrote, "Need to know what happened in flat 3B, Ashford House, Cheltenham, between 2008 and 2010. That was my childhood address, the flat where I'd lived with my parents until I was about 11, before we'd moved to Reading. I hadn't thought about that place in years. Nothing particularly interesting had happened there, as far as I knew. We'd just been an ordinary family, living an ordinary life in an ordinary flat. But I suppose some part of me was curious if there was anything to find. Any random bit of forgotten history or trivial information that might be lurking in some database somewhere. I almost deleted it. It felt stupid. But then I thought, why not? It's anonymous. Nothing would come of it. No one would bother responding to something so random and pointless. I created a temporary email address, the kind that self-destructs after a few hours, and pasted it into the form. Then I submitted the request. I closed the browser and didn't think about it again for a couple of days. Then I remembered to check the temporary email account, mostly just to see if it was still active. When I logged in, there were 3 messages waiting. The first was spam, something about cryptocurrency that I deleted immediately. The second was from the Request Exchange site itself, just a confirmation that my request had been posted. The third email had no subject line. The sender's address was just a string of random characters. I opened it. The message was brief. Information attached. Let me know if you need more. There was a zip file attached, about 30 megabytes. I downloaded it scanned it for viruses, and extracted the contents. Inside were dozens of documents, PDFs mostly, scanned images of what looked like official paperwork. The first document I opened was a tenancy agreement for Flat 3B, Ashford House, Cheltenham, dated 2006. The names on it weren't my parents' names. It was from before we'd lived there. I recognized the landlord's name though, the same property company that had managed the building when we were there. I opened another document, a police report, dated March 2009. I lived there in March 2009. I would have been about 9 years old. The report described a noise complaint, neighbors reporting shouting and sounds of a disturbance coming from Flat 3B. Officers attended, spoke to the residents who assured them everything was fine. No further action taken. I didn't remember that. I didn't remember any police coming to our flat, but I would have been a child. Maybe I'd been asleep. Maybe my parents had kept it from me. The next document was another police report, July 2009, same flat. This time neighbors reported hearing what sounded like someone crying for help. Officers attended again. Again, residents said everything was fine. The report noted that the officers had no grounds to enter without permission and that the residents had refused entry. I felt cold. That didn't make sense. We'd lived there. My mum, my dad, me. We were a normal family. We didn't have police turning up at the door. We didn't have neighbors complaining. I'd have remembered that, wouldn't I? I kept opening documents. More police reports, scattered across 2008 and 2009. More noise complaints. One report mentioned officers seeing a woman at the door who appeared distressed but claimed everything was fine. Another mentioned a man who seemed agitated and defensive. Descriptions that could have fit my parents, but the details were vague enough that I couldn't be certain. Then I found something else, a social services document, dated October 2009. It described a welfare check conducted at the property following multiple complaints from neighbors. The report stated that a child was observed in the flat and appeared withdrawn and underweight. The social worker had attempted to speak to the child, but had been prevented by the parents. A follow-up visit had been scheduled. I was the child. I had to be. I was the only child living in that flat. But I didn't remember any of this. I didn't remember being withdrawn or underweight. I didn't remember social workers visiting. I remembered my childhood as being mostly happy, normal, nothing unusual. There were more documents, follow-up reports from social services, notes about attempted visits where no one answered the door, concerns raised but insufficient evidence to take further action. Everything trailing off in early 2010, around the time we moved away. The last document in the folder was different. It was a scan of a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed, and the ink faded in places. It was addressed to the authorities, but didn't seem to have been sent anywhere. Just written and kept. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. The letter described living in Flat 3B during 2009. It talked about hearing things through the walls, a child crying at odd hours, long periods of silence, sounds like furniture being moved in the middle of the night. The writer said they'd called the police several times, but nothing had ever been done. They said they'd moved out of the building in 2010 because they couldn't stand listening anymore. They said they still thought about that flat sometimes, about what might have been happening there, about whether they should have done more. I read the letter 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in my living room, staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd just seen. I called my mum the next day. We spoke maybe once a week, usually about nothing important. She still lived in Reading with my dad. I'd seen them a few months earlier at Christmas. Everything had been normal. Fine. I kept the conversation light, asked how they were doing, mentioned work. Then, casually, I brought up Cheltenham, said I'd been thinking about the old flat, asked if she remembered much about living there. She said, not really. It had been a long time ago, just another rental property. We'd moved around a lot when I was younger because of my dad's work. Why was I asking? I said I'd just been reminiscing. Nothing important. She changed the subject, started telling me about my cousin's new baby, and I let the conversation drift away from Cheltenham entirely. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I didn't know how to. What would I even say? I found documents online suggesting something was wrong when we lived in Cheltenham, that social services had been involved, that neighbours thought something bad was happening. She'd either have an explanation that would make me feel stupid for worrying, or she'd be upset that I was digging into the past, or worse, she'd confirm that something awful had happened and I'd somehow blocked it out entirely. None of those options felt manageable. I went back to the request exchange site. My original request was still there, now marked as completed. Underneath it, the anonymous responder had left a comment. Let me know if you need more details. I created a new temporary email address and sent a message to the account that had replied to me. I asked where they'd found the information, how they'd accessed police reports and social services documents, whether everything they'd sent was real. The response came within a few hours. Everything is real, sourced from various databases and physical archives. Can provide verification if needed. Do you want more? I didn't respond. I shut my laptop and tried to pretend I'd never seen any of it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Those documents felt true. The dates lined up. The address was correct. The details were too specific to be fabricated. But they also contradicted everything I remembered about my childhood. My parents had been normal, maybe a bit strict, but not abusive, not neglectful. We'd been happy, hadn't we? I started trying to remember specifics. What had our flat in Cheltenham actually looked like? I could picture my bedroom, small with a window that overlooked the car park. I remembered the kitchen, narrow and always a bit dark. The living room with the old sofa that had a tear in one cushion. But when I tried to remember actual events, actual moments, everything became hazy. Dinners, surely we'd had dinners together. Days out, we must have gone places. But I couldn't pin down specific memories. Just vague impressions. Maybe that was normal. Maybe everyone's childhood memories are fragmented and unreliable. I was 9 years old, maybe 10. Of course I wouldn't remember everything clearly. A week passed. I tried to focus on work, on my normal life, but the documents kept circling through my mind. That letter especially. The neighbor who'd written about hearing a child crying, about long silences, about furniture being moved in the night. I went back to the site. The anonymous responder's comment was still there, offering more details. I sent another message. I asked what else they had, what else they could find about that flat, that time period, my family. The response came quickly. Can provide additional materials. Will take a few days to compile. Confirm you want to proceed. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the laptop and walked away. But I didn't. I replied, yes. 3 days later, another email arrived. Another zip file, this one larger. Over 100 megabytes. I downloaded it and extracted the contents. The folder was organized chronologically. It started in 2007, a year before my memories of living there began. There were photographs, scanned prints, not digital images. They showed the interior of Flat 3B, but not the way I remembered it. The walls were different colors. The furniture was different. These were from before we moved in. Then documents from 2008, more tenancy records, utility bills in my parents' names, council tax statements, everything normal and mundane and proving that yes, we had lived there, exactly when I thought we had. Then something else, medical records, mine, from a GP surgery in Cheltenham, appointments logged throughout 2008 and 2009. The notes were brief and clinical, but there were a lot of them. More than I'd expect for a healthy child. References to injuries, a fractured wrist in June 2008, bruising in August 2008, a suspected concussion in January 2009. Each time, the note said the parents had provided explanations. Falls, accidents, normal childhood mishaps. I don't remember any of that. I don't remember breaking my wrist. I don't remember any concussion. More documents. School records from the primary school I'd attended in Cheltenham. Attendance was patchy, lots of absences. Notes about my behavior, described as quiet and withdrawn. One teacher's note mentioned concerns about possible neglect, but stated there wasn't enough evidence to report formally. Then photographs, not scans this time. Digital images taken with a phone or camera. They showed the exterior of Ashford House at different times, day and night, different seasons, cars in the car park, windows of the building. Some of the photos had timestamps, taken in 2010, 2011, years after we'd moved away. Then photographs of other buildings, a house in Reading. I recognized it immediately. My parents' current house, the one they'd bought after we left Cheltenham. Photos of the front door, the driveway, the garden. Recent photos, judging by the car in the driveway. My dad's car. Same model, same color, same registration plate visible in one of the shots. My hands were shaking. I closed the laptop and pushed it away from me. Someone had been watching my parents' house recently, and they'd sent me the proof. I sent another email to the anonymous account. I asked who they were, why they were sending me this, what they wanted. The response came an hour later. You asked for information. I provided it. Do you want more? I wrote back, why do you have photos of my parents' house? Why are you watching them? The response, I'm not watching anyone. These were requested by someone else. I'm just the one who compiled the information. I felt sick. Someone else had requested information about my parents, about their house, about them. And this person, whoever they were, had gathered it and sent it along with everything else. I asked who had requested it. I didn't expect an answer. The response came anyway. Can't share that. But they asked for it recently, within the last few months. Wanted current information about the same family, same address history, same people. Someone had been looking into my family, into me, into the flat in Cheltenham, and what had happened there, and where we were now. I asked what else they'd shared, what else this other person had received. The response, everything I sent you, plus more. They wanted ongoing monitoring, photos, updates. I declined that request. Too much work. I asked if they knew who the other person was, anything about them. The response, no, that's how this works. Everything is anonymous. But if you want my opinion, they already knew your family. They weren't starting from scratch. They had specifics, details. They were confirming information, not discovering it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to work out who would be looking into my family. Someone from Cheltenham, an old neighbor, someone from social services who'd never forgotten about those welfare checks, or someone else entirely, someone I'd never considered. I called my mum again the next morning. I couldn't help myself. I asked if anything strange had been happening, anyone hanging around the house, any odd phone calls or visitors. She said no, everything was fine. Why was I asking these weird questions? I said I'd just been worried about her, scams and things like that. Older people getting targeted. She laughed and said she wasn't that old. And anyway, everything was fine. I wanted to believe her. I went back to the request exchange site one last time. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Some explanation maybe. Some way to make sense of it all. I scrolled through the list of completed requests, looking for anything that might be related to my family. Most were too vague to tell. But then I saw one, marked as completed about 4 months earlier. The request was simple. Need full background on family, previous addresses, Cheltenham and Reading, current status and location. That could have been about anyone, but the timing matched. 4 months ago, around when those photos of my parents' house were taken. I looked at my own request, the one I'd submitted weeks earlier. Right below it was another request, posted the day after mine. It said, "Need updated information on same family. Confirm current address and situation." Someone had seen my request, seen me asking about flat 3B in Cheltenham, and they'd submitted their own request immediately after, asking for current information about my family. I'd led them right to us. I shut down my laptop and haven't been back to that site since. I don't know what to do with the information I have. Those documents about my childhood might be real, or they might be elaborate fabrications designed to unsettle me. The photos of my parents' house might mean someone's watching them, or they might mean nothing at all. But someone out there knows who we are. They know where my parents live. They knew enough about our history to request specific information, and they received it from me because I was curious, because I thought I was clever enough to navigate something I didn't understand. My parents are fine, as far as I know. I call them more often now. Sometimes I drive up to Reading on weekends just to check on them. They think I'm being unusually attentive. They don't ask why. I haven't told them about any of this. Maybe I should. Maybe they'd have explanations for those documents from Cheltenham. Maybe they'd remember the police visits and the social workers and have perfectly reasonable explanations for all of it. Maybe I'd feel stupid for worrying. Or maybe they'd confirm that something terrible happened during those years, something they've spent decades trying to forget, and now I've dragged it all back into the light by being careless on a website I should never have visited in the first place. I don't know which possibility frightens me more. What I do know is that information never disappears. Once it's out there, once it's been compiled and shared and passed between anonymous accounts on sites you can't trace, you lose control of it completely, and sometimes the act of looking for answers creates new questions, new problems, new threats. I was wrong about being smarter than most people. I was just lucky for a long time. That luck ran out the moment I submitted that request, and now all I can do is wait and see if whoever wanted information about my family decides they need something more than just photos and documents. I check my parents' house on Google Maps sometimes, Street View, making sure it looks the same as the last time I visited, making sure nothing's changed. It's become a compulsion. Every few days, I'll pull up the image, compare it to my memory, and try to convince myself that everything's fine. But I know that somewhere out there, someone else is looking at the same house, someone with their own reasons, their own plans, and I'm the one who helped them find it. Imagine discovering that every disturbing sound you've dismissed as normal city noise was actually someone's final moments being broadcast to thousands of paying viewers on the dark web. The thing about living in a converted warehouse in East London is that you get used to strange noises. Industrial buildings weren't designed for residential living, so sounds carry in odd ways through the concrete and steel. For 2 years, I thought the sounds coming from the flat below mine were just part of urban life. Deliveries, renovations, the occasional late-night party. Now I know better, and in approximately 18 hours, I'm going to become the star of the same dark web broadcasts I've been unknowingly listening to through my floorboards. I moved into my flat in Hackney Wick after university, when the area was still affordable for someone working entry-level jobs in marketing. The building used to be a textile factory, converted into a dozen small flats with thin walls and thinner floors. Most of my neighbors were artists, freelancers, or young professionals like me who couldn't afford anywhere better. The kind of transient community where people keep to themselves and mind their own business. The flat directly below mine was occupied by someone I rarely saw. Occasionally, I'd glimpse a middle-aged man in the communal entrance, always carrying heavy bags or equipment cases. He kept odd hours and seemed to have frequent visitors, but in a building full of creative types working irregular schedules, that wasn't unusual. I knew him only as the name on the buzzer, M. Patterson. The first time I noticed something strange was about 6 months after moving in. I was working late on my laptop when I heard what sounded like someone crying through the floor. Not ordinary crying. Desperate, terrified sobbing that lasted for several minutes before stopping abruptly. I assumed it was an argument between Patterson and a partner, the kind of domestic situation you pretend not to hear in shared buildings. Over the following weeks, similar sounds occurred regularly, always late at night, always brief, always stopping suddenly. Sometimes crying, sometimes what sounded like pleading or distressed conversation. The sounds were muffled by the concrete floor, but clear enough to be disturbing. I considered complaining to the building management, but wasn't sure how to explain what I was hearing without sounding like I was spying on my neighbor. The noises gradually became more frequent and more varied. Heavy objects being moved around, electronic equipment humming constantly, what sounded like construction work happening at strange hours. Patterson seemed to have an unusual number of visitors, always arriving and leaving at night, always carrying equipment or large bags. One evening, I was coming home from work when I encountered Patterson in the stairwell. He was directing 2 other men who were carrying what appeared to be professional camera equipment up to his flat. When he saw me, he explained that he was a freelance videographer working on corporate training materials that required controlled lighting conditions. The explanation seemed reasonable, and it accounted for the equipment noises I'd been hearing. But the sounds that followed weren't consistent with normal video production. Instead of the steady hum of lights and cameras, I heard intermittent activity that suggested something more irregular was happening. Periods of intense activity followed by long silences. Sounds that suggested distress or conflict rather than professional filming. About a month later, I discovered what appeared to be the first concrete evidence of something wrong. I was taking rubbish to the communal bins when I found several items that had clearly come from Patterson's flat. Medical supplies, plastic sheeting, and cleaning products that seemed excessive for normal household use. The combination was disturbing, particularly given the sounds I'd been hearing. I started paying closer attention to the patterns of activity below. The sounds seemed to follow a schedule. Preparation phases involving equipment setup, periods of intense activity that included the distressing human sounds, followed by cleanup periods that often lasted until dawn. The pattern repeated roughly once a week, always at night, always following the same sequence. One night, curiosity got the better of me. During what sounded like a preparation phase, I went down to the communal garden behind the building and looked up at Patterson's windows. They were covered with blackout material, but I could see the edges of bright lighting equipment around the frames. What disturbed me more was seeing cables running from his windows to a small satellite dish I hadn't noticed before. The next morning, I found Patterson in the communal entrance and casually asked about his video work. He was more forthcoming than I expected, explaining that he specialized in niche content for international clients. He mentioned working with subjects who required discretion and privacy, hence the soundproofing and security measures he'd installed. He also mentioned that his work required high-speed internet connections and specialized broadcasting equipment. When I asked about the satellite dish, Patterson explained that his clients demanded secure, encrypted transmission methods that standard internet connections couldn't provide. He said he used dark web protocols to ensure client confidentiality and protect the privacy of his subjects. The explanation sounded professional, but something about his manner suggested he was being deliberately vague. Over the following days, I researched dark web broadcasting and discovered information about red rooms, allegedly live-streamed torture or murder where viewers could pay to watch or influence events. Most sources insisted they were urban legends, but some suggested they might exist using sophisticated encryption and cryptocurrency payment systems to avoid detection. The timing coincided with an escalation in the sounds from Patterson's flat. The preparation phases became longer and more complex. The periods of distress became more intense and extended. The cleanup phases seemed to involve more thorough work, including what sounded like industrial cleaning equipment. I also noticed changes in the building's internet connectivity. During Patterson's active periods, the shared Wi-Fi became unreliable, suggesting he was using substantial bandwidth for upload activity. When I mentioned this to other residents, they confirmed experiencing similar issues, always at night, always coinciding with increased activity from Patterson's flat. 2 weeks ago, everything changed. I was lying in bed around midnight when I heard sounds that were unmistakably different from the usual pattern. Instead of the typical preparation noises, I heard what sounded like a struggle, followed by someone calling for help in a voice that carried clearly through the floor. The sound suggested someone was in immediate danger. I called the police, reporting a possible domestic violence situation. They arrived within minutes and spoke to Patterson, who calmly explained that he was editing audio for a documentary about crime victims. He showed them his professional equipment and credentials and played samples of the audio he claimed to be working with. The officers seemed satisfied and left without further investigation. But Patterson knew I had called them. The next morning, I found a note pushed under my door, thanking me for my concern about the previous night's work. He explained that his documentary work sometimes involved distressing content that could be misinterpreted by neighbors. He assured me that everything was legitimate and suggested that we should discuss his work schedule to avoid future misunderstandings. When I met with Patterson that evening, he was surprisingly open about his activities. He explained that he produced specialized content for clients who paid premium rates for authentic, unscripted material. He said his work involved creating realistic scenarios that appeared genuine to viewers who were willing to pay substantial amounts for convincing performances. Patterson showed me some of his equipment, professional cameras, sophisticated lighting systems, and computer servers that he said were necessary for secure broadcasting to international clients. He explained that his subjects were paid performers who specialized in creating convincing distress reactions for discerning audiences who could distinguish between authentic and simulated content. The explanation addressed many of my concerns, but something still felt wrong. The sounds I heard didn't seem like performances. They carried an authenticity that suggested genuine fear and pain. When I mentioned this, Patterson explained that the most successful performers were those who could create truly convincing reactions, and that his clients paid premium rates specifically for content that seemed completely real. He also explained the dark web broadcasting setup, showing me how encrypted protocols and cryptocurrency payments allowed him to serve clients worldwide while maintaining their anonymity and his own security. He said this level of discretion was necessary because his content pushed boundaries that mainstream platforms wouldn't accept. Patterson concluded our conversation by mentioning that he was always looking for new performers who could create authentic reactions. He said the work paid extremely well for people who could handle intense scenarios convincingly. He suggested that if I was ever interested in supplementing my marketing income, he could arrange an audition. I declined, but Patterson's offer stayed with me. The marketing work wasn't paying enough to cover rising London rents, and the money he mentioned was substantial. Over the following days, I found myself considering his proposition, particularly when I heard what sounded like another successful session from his flat. Last week, I finally agreed to meet with Patterson about potential work. He explained that his current project involved creating content for a very specific audience that paid extraordinary amounts for authentic-seeming material. He said new performers typically started with minor roles to build comfort and confidence before progressing to more intensive scenarios. Patterson showed me the contracts his performers signed, which included substantial payment terms, confidentiality clauses, and detailed consent agreements. Everything appeared professional and legitimate. He explained that the intense reactions I'd been hearing were the result of method acting techniques that helped performers create convincing distress responses. He offered me what he called a trial role, a simple scenario that would pay enough to cover several months of rent. The work would involve a few hours of filming, following a script designed to create authentic-seeming reactions for his discerning clientele. He assured me that everything was performance, that safety protocols were in place, and that I could withdraw at any time if I became uncomfortable. I agreed to the trial, scheduled for tomorrow night. Patterson explained that the session would be broadcast to his regular audience, who had been informed about the new performer and were particularly interested in authentic reactions from first-time participants. He said the audience engagement was part of what made his content valuable. Viewers felt they were witnessing genuine experiences rather than obvious performances. But yesterday, I made a discovery that changed everything. While Patterson was out, I managed to access the building's Wi-Fi router and examine the network traffic from his flat. The data streams were massive, far larger than normal video files, and were being transmitted to multiple dark web addresses simultaneously. More disturbing was what I found when I managed to access one of these addresses through a Tor browser. Instead of the professional performance content Patterson had described, I found myself looking at what was clearly a red room operation. Live streams of genuine torture and murder, with chat functions allowing viewers to request specific actions through cryptocurrency payments. The archives showed dozens of previous broadcasts, all apparently filmed in Patterson's flat, all featuring people who displayed genuine terror and pain rather than convincing acting. These weren't performances, they were real victims, and I had been listening to their final moments through my floorboards for months. I realized that Patterson's offer wasn't for acting work. Tomorrow night's trial role was scheduled to be my final performance, broadcast live to thousands of dark web viewers who were expecting to watch someone die in the flat below mine. I've been hiding in a hotel since making this discovery, but Patterson keeps finding ways to contact me. Messages on social media, emails to accounts he shouldn't know about, even notes left at my workplace, all reminding me about tomorrow's commitment and explaining that his audience has been told to expect a new performer with authentic reactions. This morning, I found a package at my hotel room containing a tablet computer. When I turned it on, it showed a live feed of my empty flat, apparently filmed from Patterson's unit below. Text on the screen explained that the audience was already gathering for tomorrow's broadcast and that my non-appearance would disappoint viewers who had paid premium rates for the session. The message also included details about my daily routines, my workplace, my family's addresses, information that made it clear they had been monitoring me far longer than I realized. The final line explained that tomorrow's broadcast would happen regardless of my cooperation. The only question was whether I would be conscious for it. I'm writing this from another hotel, but I know they'll find me again. Patterson's operation is too sophisticated, too well-resourced, too experienced at managing unwilling participants. I've heard too many of their victims through my floorboards to believe I can escape the same fate. Tomorrow night, thousands of people on the dark web will watch a live stream from the flat below mine. They've paid in cryptocurrency to see authentic reactions from someone who doesn't know what's really happening until it's too late. They've been promised genuine terror and pain rather than acted performances. The most horrifying realization is that I've been living above a dark web red room for over a year, listening to people die while assuming they were just neighbors arguing or filming amateur videos. I've been an unwitting witness to dozens of murders, dismissing genuine cries for help as domestic disputes or creative projects. How many other people might be living above or next to similar operations? How many strange noises do we ignore because we don't want to get involved? How many victims have called for help through thin walls and floors, only to have neighbors assume it's just part of urban living? The dark web has made it possible for these operations to exist anywhere, hidden in plain sight, broadcasting horror to paying audiences, while neighbors remain oblivious to what's happening around them. The technology makes it easy to hide, to pay anonymously, to consume murder as entertainment. I should have trusted my instincts about those sounds, should have called police sooner, should have investigated more thoroughly instead of minding my own business, should have realized that genuine distress sounds different from acting or arguments. But it's too late for should-haves now. Tomorrow night, I'll probably become another voice crying through floorboards that someone else will dismiss as just neighborhood noise. Whether I show up willingly or they come to collect me, tomorrow's broadcast will feature the neighbor who lived upstairs and listened to all the previous victims without understanding what he was hearing. And somewhere above us, another neighbor will probably assume my screams are just someone having a bad night. The strangest thing about renting out your spare room on Airbnb is how normal the dangerous people can seem. 3 months ago, I thought I was just providing budget accommodation in my Nottingham terraced house to help pay the mortgage. Now I'm hiding in a travel lodge in Derby, knowing that tomorrow night thousands of people on the dark web will watch me become the unwilling star of something I helped create without realizing it. I've been hosting guests for about 18 months. My house is nothing special. 2 bedrooms, small garden, decent location near the city centre. After my partner moved out last year, I needed the extra income to cover the mortgage payments. Airbnb seemed like an obvious solution. Most guests were exactly what you'd expect: tourists, business travelers, people visiting family. The occasional odd one, but nothing concerning. The booking that changed everything came through in early November. A guest named David Chen wanted to stay for 3 weeks, paying in advance. His profile showed several good reviews from previous hosts in other cities. He claimed to be a freelance photographer working on a documentary project about urban architecture in the Midlands. The extended stay and advance payment made it an attractive booking. David arrived on a Sunday evening, carrying professional camera equipment and a large metallic case that he said contained lighting gear. He was polite, quiet, and seemed genuinely interested in the city's industrial heritage. He kept regular hours, going out during the day with his camera equipment and returning in the evening. He was the kind of guest hosts dream about: tidy, respectful, no complaints. After his first week, David asked if he could use the basement for storing and organizing his equipment. My house has a cellar that I use for storage and the boiler, accessed through a door in the kitchen. I agreed, mainly because he offered to pay an additional fee for the privilege. The extra money was helpful, and I rarely went down there anyway. Over the following days, I noticed David making multiple trips to the basement, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. When I asked about his project, he explained that he was documenting forgotten spaces in urban environments: basements, abandoned buildings, industrial sites. He said the documentation required specialized lighting and recording equipment to capture these spaces properly. About halfway through his stay, David asked if I'd be interested in featuring my house in his documentary. He explained that Victorian terraced houses like mine represented important architectural heritage, and the basement would be particularly interesting as an example of period construction techniques. He offered to pay me a consultation fee for appearing in the documentary. The money was tempting, and the project sounded legitimate. David showed me some of his previous work on his laptop: professional quality photographs and videos of various urban locations. Everything appeared above board. We agreed that he would film a short segment with me discussing the house's history and architectural features. The filming took place in the basement on a Wednesday evening. David had set up impressive lighting equipment that transformed the dingy space into something that looked almost cinematic. Multiple cameras captured different angles as I talked about the house's Victorian features and how the basement reflected period construction methods. David was professional throughout the process, asking thoughtful questions about architectural details and the neighborhood's history. The session lasted about an hour, after which he thanked me and said he'd send me a copy once the documentary was complete. I returned upstairs, feeling pleased with the extra income and curious to see the finished product. Over the next few days, I noticed David working late into the night in the basement. I could hear equipment running, the sound of keyboards, and occasionally what sounded like video editing software. When I mentioned the noise, he apologized and explained that he was under deadline pressure to complete the project. He offered to buy me noise-cancelling headphones as compensation. David's stay ended the following Sunday. He packed his equipment, thanked me for the accommodation, and left excellent feedback on the platform. I thought that would be the end of our interaction. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line contained my full name and address. The body contained a link to what appeared to be a dark web site, a .onion address that could only be accessed through specialized browsers. The message explained that my performance had been well received and that there was interest in a follow-up appearance. I was confused but curious enough to download Tor and access the link. The site had a stark, professional design with minimal text. It showed what appeared to be a preview of David's documentary, but the content was nothing like what we had filmed. The video showed my basement, but it had been edited to look like a completely different space. The lighting made it appear more confined and institutional. More disturbing was how my interview had been edited. My words about the basement's construction had been cut and rearranged to make it sound like I was describing a purpose-built space for containing people. Comments about the solid Victorian walls and soundproofing qualities of the basement had been edited to seem like I was advertising features for imprisonment. At the bottom of the page was a counter showing several thousand viewers and a section for what appeared to be cryptocurrency payments. There were also comments in various languages discussing the upcoming live event and speculation about when the subject would be brought to the location. I realized that David hadn't been making a documentary about architecture. He'd been creating promotional material for something much darker. My basement had been transformed into what appeared to be a dark web red room, and I had unknowingly provided the introduction. I tried to contact the site administrators to demand the removal of my image and information about my house, but the contact methods led to encrypted messaging systems that never responded. I considered going to the police, but explaining that I discovered my basement being advertised on the dark web for purposes I didn't fully understand seemed both implausible and potentially incriminating. Instead, I changed the locks on my house and resolved to be more careful about future guests. I thought the incident was over, that David had moved on to find another location for whatever he was really planning. 3 weeks later, I received another Airbnb booking request, this time from someone calling themselves Sarah Williams, who wanted to stay for a weekend. Her profile was sparse but contained positive reviews. She said she was visiting Nottingham for medical appointments. Something about the booking felt off. The messaging was too formal. The timing seemed random, but I needed the income. Sarah arrived on Friday evening carrying a small bag and what appeared to be medical equipment. She explained that she had a rare condition requiring specialized monitoring devices. She was polite and professional, much like David had been. She asked about the basement almost immediately, claiming she needed a quiet, temperature-controlled environment for her medical equipment. I refused, explaining that the basement wasn't suitable for guests. She seemed disappointed but didn't press the issue. However, that night I heard sounds from the basement, footsteps, equipment being moved, voices. When I investigated, I found the door unlocked and evidence that someone had been down there recently. Sarah had gone out, ostensibly for a medical appointment, but I suspected she was connected to David's project. I searched her room and found sophisticated computer equipment hidden in her luggage, along with what appeared to be dark web communication devices. I also found printed materials in various languages, advertising a live event scheduled for the following week. I confronted Sarah when she returned, demanding an explanation. She remained calm and professional, but her story changed. She claimed to be working with David on a legitimate research project about urban exploration and abandoned spaces. She showed me documents that appeared to support this explanation, including what looked like academic credentials and research permits. But that night, I discovered the truth about what was happening in my basement. Unable to sleep, I crept downstairs and found Sarah working at a computer setup I hadn't seen before. Multiple screens showed dark web sites with familiar .onion addresses, cryptocurrency wallets with substantial balances, and chat systems discussing the upcoming Nottingham event. One screen showed my basement, but it had been further modified since David's visit. Additional equipment had been installed, including restraints and what appeared to be medical monitoring devices. The space had been transformed into a fully functional red room, complete with multiple camera angles and interactive systems that would allow dark web viewers to influence what happened there. Sarah noticed me watching, and her demeanor changed completely. She explained that I was already complicit in their operation, that my filmed introduction had been used to promote the space, and that my continued cooperation was expected. She showed me viewer statistics and payment records demonstrating the substantial interest in the Nottingham facility. The final component of their plan was clear. They needed a host for the space, someone who could provide legitimacy and deflect suspicion, someone who could book future guests and maintain the property between events, someone who was already compromised by their participation in the promotional material. I told Sarah to leave immediately, that I would contact the police, that I wanted nothing to do with their operation. She remained calm, explaining that the evidence of my participation was already online, that my face and voice were associated with the space, that authorities would find it difficult to believe I wasn't aware of what was happening in my own basement. She left the next morning, but not before explaining that the Nottingham event would proceed as scheduled, that interested parties had already paid substantial sums to access the broadcast, that the space was prepared and the audience was waiting. Over the following week, I received constant messages through various platforms, encrypted emails, anonymous texts, dark web communications. All carried the same theme. I was expected to facilitate the upcoming event, to provide access to the space, to ensure that operations could proceed without interference. I've been staying in different hotels since then, but the messages keep finding me. They know my location, my schedule, my vulnerabilities. They provided evidence of their surveillance, photographs of me in public, recordings of my phone conversations, details about my daily routines. Yesterday, I received the most explicit message yet, a video showing my basement fully prepared for broadcast with professional lighting and multiple camera angles, a countdown timer showing less than 24 hours remaining, and a reminder that my cooperation was not optional, that I had already been promoted as the host of the facility, that thousands of dark web viewers were expecting the event to proceed. The message included details about how they had tracked my movements, monitored my communications, and prepared contingencies for various scenarios. They had evidence of my filmed introduction, records of payments made to my accounts, and documentation of my voluntary participation in what they could present as willing cooperation with their operation. I'm writing this from a travel lodge outside Derby, using a public computer. I don't know if this will reach anyone who can help, or if sharing this story will make my situation worse. I only know that tomorrow night, thousands of people on the dark web will expect to see a broadcast from my basement, and I'm running out of places to hide. The most terrifying realization is that they never needed to force me to participate. They just needed me to become complicit gradually, one small decision at a time. Accepting David's booking, agreeing to the basement usage, participating in the filming. Each step seemed reasonable individually, but together they created a chain of involvement I can't escape. The dark web red room they've created isn't in some remote warehouse or abandoned building. It's in my house, registered to my name, promoted with my face and voice. Even if I never participate directly, I'm already the host. The space exists because I allowed it to be created. Tomorrow's broadcast will happen whether I'm there or not. They've made that clear. The only question is whether I face whatever comes next, or let someone else become the victim of a system I inadvertently helped build. The viewer counter on the latest message shows tens of thousands of people waiting, people who have paid in cryptocurrency to access the broadcast, people who believe they're about to see something exclusive and authentic, people who don't care that the host never intended to become part of this horror. I keep thinking about David's professional demeanor, Sarah's medical equipment story, the gradual way they transform my basement into something unrecognizable. How many other Airbnb hosts have been approached with similar projects? How many spare rooms and basements across the country might be serving similar purposes? The dark web has made it possible for these operations to exist anywhere, to recruit hosts unknowingly, to create content that appears consensual but isn't. The technology makes it easy to hide, to pay anonymously, to consume horror without consequence. I should have trusted my instincts about David's equipment, should have questioned why he needed such sophisticated gear for architectural photography, should have refused to participate in any filming, should have investigated the basement modifications more carefully. But it's too late for regrets now. Tomorrow night, my basement becomes a dark web broadcast studio. Whether I'm there or someone else takes my place, the show will go on. I've always been good with languages. It's the one skill that came naturally to me when everything else felt like a struggle. By 25, I was fluent in 4 languages besides English and working on a 5th. People assumed I'd become a teacher or join the diplomatic service, but translation work paid better and let me work from home in my small flat in Oxford. Most of my jobs came through a freelancer website where clients post projects and translators bid for the work. It's competitive, but I'd built a solid reputation for accuracy and discretion, particularly with technical or specialized content. The majority of my work involved translating business documents, academic papers, or technical manuals. Nothing exciting, but it paid the bills. 3 months ago, I received a private message through the platform from someone who didn't have a public profile. They claimed to represent a research group studying dark web communication systems and needed a translator for content in languages I specialized in: Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. The message explained that the content might be disturbing as it related to criminal networks operating on the dark web, but assured me the research was for academic purposes and would help law enforcement agencies monitor these hidden corners of the internet. The pay they offered was substantial, nearly triple my usual rate, enough to clear my student debts within months rather than years. They explained the higher compensation was due to the disturbing nature of the material and the strict confidentiality requirements. I'd need to sign an extensive non-disclosure agreement and work through their secure platform rather than my usual channels. I should have been more skeptical, but the opportunity felt legitimate. The email addresses used academic domains, the contracts appeared professional, and the initial test translation they sent, an analysis of communication methods used by drug cartels, seemed consistent with criminology research. Besides, I'd translated medical documents and legal depositions before that contained disturbing content. I was confident in my ability to remain detached and professional. After completing the test piece to their satisfaction, I received access to their secure platform. It required multiple layers of authentication and used encryption that seemed unnecessarily robust for academic research, but I rationalized that this level of security made sense for sensitive work involving dark web criminal networks. They even provided me with special software to access .onion sites, dark web addresses not accessible through standard browsers. The first few weeks involved translating text conversations, dark web forum posts, and what appeared to be marketplace listings from various languages into English. The content was disturbing, discussions of drug trafficking, weapons sales, and human smuggling on hidden sites accessible only through Tor networks. But nothing beyond what I'd expected given the project description. I maintained professional distance, focusing on accuracy rather than content. About a month into the project, the nature of the assignments began to shift. I started receiving links to video files hosted on their secure server. The brief explained that these were recordings of conversations between members of criminal organizations, and they needed both verbal and behavioral translations, noting cultural contexts and non-verbal communication that might not be obvious to researchers unfamiliar with the languages and cultures involved. The first few videos matched this description. Grainy footage of people discussing what appeared to be illegal business transactions in various languages. I transcribed and translated their conversations, noted cultural nuances, and provided context where needed. Then the videos began to change. The quality improved. The settings became more controlled. Stark rooms with concrete walls, minimal furniture, professional lighting. The conversations became one-sided, with one person speaking directly to the camera, while others remained silent in the background. The speakers began addressing viewers directly, promising special experiences and authentic content. I told myself this was just deeper research into how these networks marketed themselves, but I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the material. When I asked my contact about the changing nature of the content, they explained that the research had progressed to studying how these networks advertised to potential customers. The explanation seemed reasonable enough for me to continue. One night, I received an urgent translation request with a substantial bonus for immediate completion. The file was a live stream recording in Russian, hosted on a dark website with a complex .onion address. When I opened it, I was confronted with something I had never expected to see. The video showed a room similar to those I'd been seeing recently, but this time there was a person restrained in a chair. A masked individual stood nearby, occasionally adjusting camera equipment. The Russian speaker was describing what was about to happen and explaining how viewers could influence the proceedings through cryptocurrency payments. The entire setup was clearly a dark web red room, a live-streamed torture session where anonymous viewers could pay to request specific actions from anywhere in the world while hiding behind layers of encryption. I immediately closed the file and messaged my contact, explaining that I couldn't participate in translating this type of content and that they should report it to authorities. Their response was alarmingly casual. They thanked me for my concern, but explained that this was a sophisticated simulation created to study how these networks operated. They assured me no one was actually harmed in the creation of these educational materials. I wasn't convinced, but I also had no proof that what I'd seen wasn't staged. I decided to withdraw from the project anyway, citing ethical concerns. They accepted my decision and processed my final payment, which appeared in my bank account the next day, significantly more than what I was owed, with a note classifying the excess as a discretionary bonus for exceptional service. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I received an email from a different address containing a video file. When I opened it, I saw a compilation of clips showing me in my flat, working at my desk, sleeping, showering, talking on the phone. All filmed from angles that suggested cameras had been installed throughout my home. The email contained no message, just the video. I searched my flat frantically, finding tiny cameras concealed in smoke detectors, light fixtures, and air vents. I removed them all, changed my locks, and spent the night at a friend's house. When I returned the next day, I found an envelope had been slipped under my door containing a USB drive. The drive held a single file, a video of what appeared to be an actual dark web Red Room broadcast, not a simulation. The setting was similar to the videos I'd been translating, but this was clearly real. The victim's fear was palpable, the violence undeniable. At the end of the video, text appeared in all 5 languages I spoke, stating that I was now complicit in their operation and that my translations had helped them expand their dark web audience to new markets across multiple language barriers. I went to the police immediately. I showed them the cameras I'd found, explained the work I'd been doing, and described the threatening video. They took the report seriously and sent an officer to check my flat for additional surveillance equipment. They found nothing beyond what I'd already discovered, but advised me to stay elsewhere while they investigated. Their investigation revealed that the academic domains used in the emails were spoofed. The payment had come through a series of dark web cryptocurrency exchanges designed to be untraceable. The secure platform I'd been working on had disappeared completely, leaving no digital footprint. They told me this had the hallmarks of a sophisticated dark web criminal operation and suggested I remain vigilant but try to resume normal life. I spent the next few weeks staying with friends, checking for surveillance, and jumping at every unexpected noise. Eventually, with no further contact from the people who had hired me, I began to relax slightly. Perhaps they had moved on, finding another translator who wouldn't question their requests. Then the messages started appearing on my phone. Text messages in different languages, all containing variations of the same theme. They knew where I was, they were watching me, and I had unfinished work to complete. The messages came from different numbers, sometimes in languages I didn't even work with. I changed my number twice, but the messages always found me. About a month after I went to the police, I received a package at my new temporary address, a place only my closest friends knew about. Inside was a high-quality digital camera and a list of instructions in multiple languages. I was to set up the camera at specific angles, test lighting conditions, and prepare for a live translation assignment at a designated time. The instructions emphasized that failure to comply would result in the release of videos showing me viewing and translating material related to criminal activities. I took the package to the police, who added it to their investigation, but warned me that these networks were notoriously difficult to track. They suggested I consider temporarily relocating to a different city while they continued to investigate. I moved to Glasgow, where a university friend had a spare room in her flat. I told no one except my immediate family where I was going. I found work translating mundane corporate documents under a different name. I started to rebuild some semblance of normal life. 3 weeks ago, I noticed someone following me home from the small office where I'd found work, a nondescript man in a dark coat who maintained the same distance behind me for several streets. When I changed direction suddenly, he adjusted his course to match. I lost him by ducking into a department store and leaving through a different exit, but the encounter left me shaken. The following day, I received an email containing a street view photograph of the building where I was staying in Glasgow. The subject line was simply, "Found you," written in all 5 languages I spoke. 2 days later, a courier delivered a package to my workplace. Inside was another digital camera, identical to the one I turned over to the police, and a note explaining that my debut broadcast had been scheduled for the following week. This time, the note included details about my friend's daily routine, my parents' home address, and my sister's workplace. The threat was clear: comply or those close to me would suffer. I'm now in a small bed and breakfast in the Scottish Highlands, using a public computer to write this. I've left my phone, laptop, and all other trackable devices behind. I paid cash for the train ticket and registered under a false name. But I know this is only a temporary solution. The most terrifying realization is that these people don't just want a translator. They want a performer. Someone who can communicate with victims and viewers in multiple languages simultaneously. Someone who can expand their audience beyond English-speaking viewers. Someone who can bring a unique skill to their broadcasts. When I translate materials, I don't just convert words from one language to another. I convey nuance, emotion, cultural context. I make communication feel natural and authentic across language barriers. It's a skill that took years to develop, and now it's being sought after for the most horrific purpose imaginable. The scheduled date for what they're calling my debut broadcast is 3 days from now. I've stopped running because I've realized there's nowhere I can go that they won't eventually find me. These people have resources, connections, and apparently unlimited access to surveillance. They tracked me across 3 cities through name changes and new devices. I've contacted the police again, sharing everything I know about the scheduled broadcast. They've promised to increase patrols near my family's homes and to continue investigating, but they've been frank about the limitations they face with these types of networks. Jurisdiction issues, encryption, anonymizing technology, all create barriers to effective law enforcement action. I keep thinking about how I unwittingly help these people expand their dark web audience. How many translations did I provide that helped them reach new viewers in the hidden corners of the internet? How many people paid in Bitcoin to access content because they could now understand what was being offered? I became part of their dark web operation without realizing it, and now they want to bring me fully into their world. Tonight, the owner of the bed and breakfast knocked on my door to let me know a package had arrived for me. A package addressed to the false name I'm using at a location I selected at random just yesterday. I haven't opened it. It's sitting on the dresser as I write this. I know what it contains. Another camera, another set of instructions, another reminder that they can find me anywhere. The broadcast is scheduled for Saturday night. I'm running out of options and places to hide. I keep hoping the police investigation will yield results before then, but I'm not optimistic. These networks have stayed ahead of law enforcement for years. They wouldn't have survived this long if they were easy to catch. The most disturbing thought is that if they force me to participate, thousands of people in multiple countries will be watching on the dark web. People who have paid in untraceable cryptocurrency for access. People hiding behind anonymous Tor browsers. People who consider this dark web entertainment. And I'll be expected to translate the horror into their native languages, making sure nothing is lost in translation. I never thought my gift for languages would make me valuable to people like this. I never imagined my skills would be sought after for something so horrific on the dark web. But in a perverse way, it makes sense. Expanding markets in the darkest corners of the internet requires breaking down language barriers, even for the most terrible content hidden behind layers of encryption and anonymity. I don't know what I'll do when Saturday comes. I don't know if there's anywhere left to run. I only know that my words have power, and for the first time in my life, that terrifies me. The package on the dresser just moved slightly. I think my time is up.